On the 10th of March 2024, the most controlled image operation in British public life made its worst mistake. Kensington Palace released a photograph of Kate Middleton with her 3 children. It was Mother's Day in the United Kingdom. Kate had been invisible since January, since the palace announced she had undergone abdominal surgery and would be absent from public duties for an unspecified period. 8 weeks of silence, 8 weeks of speculation. And now, finally, a photograph. The caption thanked the public for their support. It was signed with a C. Within 5 hours, the Associated Press killed it. The kill notice, the industry term for the instructions sent to every news organization that has published a photograph, said that closer inspection had revealed the source had manipulated the image. The photo shows an inconsistency in the alignment of Princess Charlotte's left hand. No replacement photo will be sent. Reuters killed it. AFP killed it. Getty killed it. PA, the Press Association, Britain's own domestic wire service, killed it. All 5 of the world's major photographic agencies, within hours of each other, on the same Sunday afternoon, killed the same photograph that Kensington Palace had released as the answer to 8 weeks of mounting public concern. Kensington Palace declined to comment. The next morning, Kate posted an apology on social media. She said, "Like many amateur photographers, I do occasionally experiment with editing. I wanted to express my apologies for any confusion the family photograph we shared yesterday caused." The woman who had been running the most successful image operation in the British royal family's modern history had released a manipulated photograph during the most scrutinized period of her public life, and the 5 agencies who exist to verify and distribute images of the world's most prominent people had collectively, simultaneously, told the world they could not trust it. Within 4 days, AFP's global news director Phil Chetwynd said in an interview that Kensington Palace was no longer considered a trusted source. No longer a trusted source. This is not a phrase that photographic agencies use casually. It is the institutional verdict of the people whose entire professional function is to assess whether images can be believed, and the people whose function is to assess whether images can be believed had assessed the image from Kensington Palace and found it wanting. This is not the account of what happened to the photograph. The photograph is the symptom. The photograph is what happens when the image operation that has been running for 13 years, the operation that turned Kate Middleton from a party supplies heiress called Waity Katie into the most admired woman in Britain, encounters a situation that the image operation cannot control. The situation it could not control was cancer. This account examines the image operation. What it was, what it required, what it produced, what it cost, and what happened when the operation's subject, who had been managed, curated, calibrated and controlled since before she was engaged, was suddenly, privately, genuinely ill, and the machine that had been running her public life for 13 years reached for the only tool it had available. It edited the photograph. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton was born on the 9th of January, 1982, in the Royal Berkshire Hospital in Reading. Her father Michael had been a British Airways flight dispatcher. Her mother Carol had been a British Airways flight attendant. They had met at the airline. They had married in 1980. By the time Catherine was born, Michael had left the airline and the family had moved to Amman, Jordan, where he had taken a job with British Airways in a more senior capacity. Catherine was 2 years old when they returned to England. None of this is the formation. The formation is what came next. In 1987, when Catherine was 5 years old, Carol Middleton started a company called Party Pieces from the kitchen table of the family home in Bradfield Southend, Berkshire. Party Pieces sold party supplies by mail order. It started small and grew steadily across the decade that followed. By the 1990s, it had become a substantial commercial operation. By the time Catherine met William at St Andrews in 2001, the Middletons were millionaires. By the time the wedding photographs were being taken at Westminster Abbey in 2011, Party Pieces was worth an estimated £30 million. The formation is not the money. The formation is what the money represented in the specific social world that the money was being made in. The specific social world was the British class system of the 1980s and 1990s. The British class system of the 1980s and 1990s was the system that had been producing its specific verdicts on the people within it since long before the 1980s and 1990s, and that was producing its specific verdicts on the Middletons with the specific clarity of the system that has always been very clear about where it places the people within it. The Middletons were new money. New money in Britain is the money that has no associated title or landed heritage or generational establishment connection. New money is the money that other people have decided is not old enough to count as the right kind of money. The right kind of money had titles attached to it. The right kind of money had country houses and debits entries and the specific social credentials that the British upper class had been using to distinguish itself from the people who had merely made a great deal of money since before the Industrial Revolution had made the making of a great deal of money the available option for the people whose formation was not the formation of the established. The Middletons were not the established, they were the successful. The successful and the established are not the same thing in the British class system, and the British class system has always been very precise about the difference. Catherine attended St Andrew's School in Pangbourne until the age of 13. She was then sent to Downe House, the girls' boarding school in Cold Ash, Berkshire. The Downe House experience was not the experience that the Middletons had intended. She was bullied. The bullying has been described in the accounts of the period as the specific bullying of the girl who has arrived at the school without the social credentials that the school's existing social world has decided are the credentials whose absence marks the person for the bullying. Orendus quiet, she was sporty. She was bookish. She was not, by the accounts of the former classmates and teachers who have described the Downe House years, the person who had the specific social ease of the person whose formation had produced the social ease of the British upper-class girl, who had been in the specific social world since birth. She had arrived from outside. The arriving from outside was the problem. She left Downe House after 2 terms. Her parents moved her to Marlborough College in Wiltshire, which was the school that suited her considerably better. Marlborough College was the school where the specific qualities that the bullying at Downe House had been directed at, the bookishness, the athleticism, the specific self-contained quality of the person who did not require the social validation of the available social world, became the qualities that the available social world of Marlborough College found interesting rather than threatening. She thrived at Marlborough. She became head of house. She was the girl who all the boys fancied, as one former classmate told the press years later. She was popular, she was sporty, she played hockey and tennis and netball, she was good at art. She became the person that the Downe House years had been attempting to prevent her from becoming by deploying the specific mechanisms of the social world's management of the person who has arrived without the credentials. The mechanisms had not worked. She had left Downe House and had gone to Marlborough and had become the person who thrived. The specific quality of the person who has survived the bullying and then thrived is the specific quality of the person whose formation has included the early lesson that the available social world's verdict on the person is not necessarily the accurate verdict on the person. The early lesson that the social world's verdict can be wrong. The early lesson that the performance of the self in the available social world is the performance that can be managed, rather than the authentic expression that the social world is receiving and assessing. The managing of the performance. This is the thing that the Downe House experience and the Marlborough recovery together produced as the specific quality of the formation. Not the coldness, the managing, the specific quality of the person who has learned that the social world's assessment of them can be influenced by the specific management of the available performance rather than the passive reception of the social world's verdict. She gap-yeared in Florence. She studied art history. She applied to St Andrews and was accepted. She deferred for a year when William deferred, which is the biographical detail that the subsequent coverage has most consistently read as the evidence of the planning. The gap year timed to match the future king's gap year. The university choice timed to match the future king's university choice. Whether the timing was the planning or the coincidence is the question that the available sources have not resolved with the certainty that the resolution would require. What is established is that she went to St Andrews, and at St Andrews she met William. The specific occasion of the meeting is the occasion that the subsequent mythology has organized around the transparent dress. The fashion show at St. Andrews in March 2002, at which Catherine wore a see-through dress over a bikini as part of the student charity fashion show, and at which William, who was in the front row, having paid £200 for his seat, reportedly said, "Wow, Kate's hot." The wow and the hot, and the £200 front row seat are the mythology's central elements. The mythology is probably not entirely accurate. The central elements are probably not the specific accurate account of the specific moment, in the specific way that the mythology has organized them. But the mythology contains the truth, that the mythology always contains. The truth in the available form of the story, rather than the truth in the available form of the documented fact. The truth was that William noticed her, and the noticing was the beginning of the thing. She was careful from the beginning. This is the quality that the people who knew her at St. Andrews, and who have described the St. Andrews years from the available positions, have consistently identified as the quality most visible in the period when the relationship with William was becoming the relationship that it became. She was careful, she did not perform, she did not deploy the available social world's management of the person who is in proximity to the future king, in the specific form of the performance of the person who wants to be noticed by the future king. She was simply there. She was the flatmate, and then the friend, and then the girlfriend, in the specific way that the person who is careful and who does not perform is simply the person who is there, rather than the person who is performing, the being there. The careful and the not performing was the specific quality that worked. William was surrounded by people who performed around him. The performing was the specific adjustment that proximity to royalty always produces in the people who are proximate to it, the specific calibration of the self in the direction of the thing that the proximity to the royal seems to require. Catherine did not calibrate, she was simply present. The simply present was the thing that worked. They became a couple in 2003. The relationship was conducted across the remaining years at St. Andrews and into the years following graduation in 2005, in the specific way that the relationship of two young people in their early 20s who are not yet publicly committed and who are managing the available media attention and the available social world is conducted. Which is to say, carefully, privately, and with the specific awareness that the available media attention was the available media attention of the British tabloid press in the years immediately following Diana's death, when the press's relationship to the young royals and the young royals' relationship to the press was being managed through the specific mechanisms of the managed distance and the careful public presence. The managed distance and the careful public presence. This is the thing that the St. Andrews years and the post-St. Andrews years together produced as the available formation. The formation of the person who has learned to manage the available distance and the careful public presence as the organizing principles of the navigable public life. The press's name for her during these years was Waity Katie. The Waity Katie was the press's specific designation for the person who was waiting for the proposal that the press had decided was the thing she was waiting for. And the waiting for the proposal was the press's specific reading of the situation of the young woman who had been with the future king for several years, and who was not yet engaged, and who did not have a job of the kind that the press had decided she should have, and who was living the life of the person who is waiting, rather than the life of the person who is doing. She was not waiting, or rather, she was waiting in the specific sense that the person who is in a relationship with the future king is always waiting for the relationship to resolve into the available institutional form. But the waiting was not the passive waiting of the Waity Katie characterization. It was the active waiting of the person who was managing the available situation in the specific form of the managed public presence, and the careful private navigation, and the specific qualities that the Marlborough College formation and the Downe House survival had produced as the available qualities. The formation had produced the person who could manage the waiting without the waiting being visible as the waiting that it was. The Queen Elizabeth II, by the accounts of the period, was not impressed. A palace source told the Daily Mail in the years before the engagement that the Queen was furious with Kate because she was simply lazy, and that the palace had pressured her to find a proper job and not wait idly for William's proposal. The fact that Kate is sitting around waiting for William to show up with an engagement ring could negatively affect the monarchy, the source added. The source was wrong about the laziness, but the source was accurate about the palace's assessment of the situation. The palace's assessment of the situation was the assessment of the institution that had decided what it required from the future queen, and that had found in the waiting period the available evidence for the assessment. The palace did not want her. This is the Christopher Anderson assessment, the biographer who wrote Kate, and who assembled the accounts of the palace insiders who described the atmosphere of the years before the engagement. Camilla was one of Kate's fiercest critics in the beginning, Anderson reported. She did not think she was up to snuff, as it were. She was below the salt. People like Camilla didn't want her because they felt that she was too common to be the wife of a future king. Too common. The phrase that the Downe House girls had been deploying against her in a different register, the unspoken verdict that the new money's daughter was not the right kind of person for the available social world, was now the phrase that the palace's people were deploying in their own register. Too common. The formation that Downe House had provided as the early lesson, that the social world's verdict is not necessarily the accurate verdict and can be managed, was now the formation being tested against the largest available social world. The largest available social world was the palace. The palace had decided she was too common. She had managed the Downe House verdict. She would need to manage the palace verdict too. She did. She managed it with the specific quality that the formation had produced: the careful, the not performing, the managed public presence, the simply present. She managed it for 9 years, and in November 2010, William proposed to her with his mother's ring in Kenya. The palace had not wanted her. The palace got her, and then the palace made her. They broke up in April 2007. William ended it. The specific reasons have been described in the available accounts in the available form. The pressure of the relationship's public dimension, William's uncertainty about the commitment, the specific restlessness of the 24-year-old who is simultaneously the heir to the British throne, and the person whose personal life the entire available press is organized around documenting. He ended it. She did not make a scene. This is the biographical detail that the accounts of the 2007 breakup have consistently identified as the detail that most precisely establishes the specific quality that had been building across the years at St. Andrews and after. She did not make a scene. She went out. She got dressed. She put on the short dress and the heels, and she went to the clubs with her friends, and she was photographed looking, the word that the coverage of the period consistently deployed. Fine. Not devastated. Not publicly angry. Not the person whose private emotional state was available for the public record in the form that the private emotional state becomes available for the public record when the person whose private emotional state it is allows it to become available. Fine. She looked fine. She conducted herself as the person who was managing the available situation with the available quality that the Marlborough College formation and the Downe House survival had produced as the available quality. The managing. Always the managing. The royal commentators who covered the breakup period described what they observed. She was tough as nails about the snobbery, said royal expert Katie Nicholl, who was documenting the relationship from the inside of the press world that was covering it. She never rose to it. When William's friends at the Bougee's nightclub in West London would say, "Doors to manual" as she arrived, the specific jibe at Carol's career as a flight attendant, the shorthand for the middle-class mother who had worked in the airline industry, she did not respond. She did not acknowledge. She absorbed the jibe and continued being the person who was in the club and who was managing the available social world in the direction of the simply present. The breakup lasted approximately 3 months. They were back together by the summer of 2007. The Telegraph profile of Catherine, written in the period before the engagement, characterized the reconciliation as Miss Middleton making it clear to him she would not be taken for granted. The not being taken for granted characterization was the characterization of the person who had been depicted as the waiting and who was now being depicted as the person who had stopped the waiting in the specific form of the assertion of the self's value to the person who had failed to value it sufficiently. Whether the reconciliation was the assertion of the self's value or the simple return of the two people who had been together for 4 years and who had found the separation unsatisfying, is the question that the available sources have not resolved in the form that the resolution would require. What is established is the return. What is also established is the specific way that the return was covered, not as the woman who had taken the man back, but as the woman who had established the terms of her own value. The press that had been calling her Waity Katie had converted the reconciliation into the evidence of the waiting's strategic wisdom. She had been waiting. She had been right to wait. Now she had won. This is not accurate. Winning was not the available framework for the specific quality of the 10 years between meeting William in 2001 and marrying him in 2011. The winning framework requires the contest in which the winning occurs, and the contest framework requires the specific opponent whose defeat is the winning's product. There was no contest in the specific sense that the winning framework requires. There was the relationship and the managing and the careful and the simply present across 10 years of being the person who was managed by the press as the Waity Katie, and who was being assessed by the palace as the too common, and who was simultaneously managing the available public world in the direction of the not visible private interior. The not visible private interior is the thing that the 10 years produced most significantly, not the public presence. The public presence was the managed product of the formation. The not visible private interior was the interior of the person who had been through Downe House and Marlborough and St Andrews and the Bougies nightclub and the doors to Manual and the Waity Katie and the palace's too common and the first breakup and the carefully managed return, and who had processed all of it in the specific private form of the person who does not make it available for the public record. She was being formed, not by the palace, not yet. The palace formation had not yet begun. She was being formed by the decade of the available experience, in the form that the experience forms the person who experiences it, while being careful not to perform the experiencing. The formation was the formation of the person who has learned, across a decade of the specific experience of being in proximity to the largest available institutional power, while not yet being inside it, what the institutional power requires of the people who are inside it. She was learning from the outside. The learning from the outside is the specific quality of the formation that the palace had not anticipated when it had decided she was too common and when Camilla had decided she was below the salt. The formation that the outside produces in the person who is watching the institution from the outside is the formation of the person who sees the institution in the form that the institution's insiders cannot see it, the form of the person who is not yet inside the requirements, and who is therefore available to observe the requirements in the form that the requirements become visible when the person observing them is outside them. She was observing for 10 years. The observing produced the knowledge. The knowledge would become the performance. The performance would become the image operation. The press in those years was not simply the tabloid press of the Waity Katie characterization. It was also the specific machinery of the early internet era's celebrity coverage, the paparazzi culture, the long lenses, the specific economic incentive of the photograph of the future queen's future girlfriend in a state of any visible distress or embarrassment. The machinery was organized around producing the photograph. The photograph required the distress or the embarrassment or the private moment that the private moment's publicity converts from the private to the available. She produced very few of those photographs. Not none. There were the photographs of the nightclub exits and the ski holidays and the moments of the ordinary life that the paparazzi documented in the ordinary way. But the specific photographs that the machinery was most organized around producing, the distress, the embarrassment, the private moment that reveals the interior, were the photographs that the 10 years of the careful and the managing and the simply present produced in notably small numbers. This was not the cold. The cold is the characterization of the person who has no interior to manage. This was the management. The management of the person who has a thoroughly present interior and who has identified the management of the interior's public visibility as the critical available skill for the person in her specific position. The specific position was the position of the person who was in proximity to the future king and who was not yet the future queen, and who was therefore in the most vulnerable available position of the available positions, not inside the institution's protection and not outside the institution's attention. Inside the attention without the protection. The position requires the management most acutely. She managed it most acutely. The year 2008 produced the photograph that most precisely captures the specific quality of the management across the 10 years. Not a staged photograph, the candid photograph of the person who has been photographed by the long lens and who has produced for the long lens the specific expression that the management produces when the management is the organizing principle of the available public self. She is smiling. She is always smiling. The smile is the managed smile, not the performed smile of the person who is uncomfortable and who is managing the discomfort through the performance of the comfort. The managed smile of the person who has decided that the smile is the available form and who has made the available form the automatic form. The automatic form. This is what the 10 years were producing, the managed and the careful and the simply present being converted, across the decade of the repetition, from the considered choices of the person who is managing the available situation to the automatic form of the person who no longer needs to consider because the managing has been internalized as the available expression. The automatic form is what the subsequent biographers described as the polish. She was polished. She was always perfectly turned out. She never put a foot wrong. The never putting a foot wrong and the always perfectly turned out were the automatic form of the decade of the managing and the careful and the simply present. William's friends at the nightclub had called her doors to manual. The doors to manual had been the jibe at the mother who had been the air hostess. The irony of the doors to manual jibe is the irony of the available form. The air hostess is the specific professional whose training includes the management of the available emotional expression in the form of the professional availability, the specific quality of the person who is trained to produce the expression that the passengers require from the available cabin crew, regardless of the actual emotional state of the cabin crew producing it. Carol had trained as the air hostess. The air hostess training is the training of the managed expression. The doors to manual jibe was the jibe at the managed expression's origin. The managed expression's daughter had absorbed the training's specific quality in the specific form that the family formation produces, rather than the professional training. She had grown up watching the managed expression as the available form. She had made the managed expression her own. Not cold. The cold is the absence of the interior. This was the coverage. The coverage is the managed availability of the interior in the specific form that the management permits. She also, across the 10 years, learned the specific geography of the institution she was not yet inside. She learned it from the outside. The specific geography includes the specific social world of the landed aristocracy and the specific requirements that the landed aristocracy's social world produces for the people within it, and the specific locations and occasions and specific demands of the institutional calendar. She learned all of this without being given the formal briefing that the inside person receives as the inside person's formation. She observed it from the outside, and she absorbed it, and she produced, from the observing and the absorbing, the knowledge that the institution would eventually deploy as the formation. The palace had been worried about the common. The common had been doing the homework. In November 2010, they were on holiday in Kenya, at a private residence on Lake Rutundu, when William proposed. He used his mother's engagement ring, the sapphire surrounded by diamonds. The ring that Diana had chosen from the Garrard catalogue in 1981 because she had not been permitted to have a custom ring made, and that had become the ring whose specific emotional weight the entire world had been assigning to it since August 1997. He put it on her finger. He had been carrying it in his rucksack for 3 weeks. She said yes. The announcement was made on the 16th of November 2010. The engagement interview with ITN was the first time the public had heard her speak in the sustained form of the interview rather than the brief public appearances she had been managing across the decade. The specific quality of the person who had been managing the available public world for 10 years was visible in the interview in the specific form of the person who produces the available answers in the available form without the visible tells of the person who has not been managing the available public world for 10 years. She was composed, she was warm, she was the Marlborough formation and the Downe House survival and the 10 years of the managing and the careful and the simply present produced in the available form of the interview. she was also, for the first time, inside the protection. The institution whose attention she had been navigating from the outside was now the institution she was inside. The inside came with the protection. The protection came with the machine. The machine was the Kensington Palace communications operation. The machine was the thing that would take the decade of the self-produced managing and the careful and the simply present and convert them into the image operation that the next 13 years would deploy. The next 13 years would produce the most successful image in the modern British monarchy, and then it would kill the photograph. The Kensington Palace communications operation in the years following the April 2011 wedding was not the communications operation that had existed before it. The wedding had changed the scale, the wedding had changed the resource, and the wedding had changed the specific available person whose image the operation was organized around managing. Before the wedding, Kate Middleton had been managing her own image. She had been doing it for 10 years from the outside, with the formation she had built from the Downe House experience and the Marlborough recovery, and the decade of the careful and the managing and the simply present. The managing had been her own. The tools had been her own. The results had been the results of the individual person's management of the available situation with the available tools. After the wedding, the tools were institutional. The institutional tools were the communications team, whose function was the management of the image in the available institutional form. The communications team was staffed by the people whose professional formation was the formation of the communications professional. The people who had been trained in the specific skills of the institutional image management, and who had been deployed to the specific function of managing the image of the future king and the future queen. The team was not the improvised operation of the person who has never managed a royal household before. It was the specific professional operation of the people whose professional function was the specific management of the specific image in the specific available public forms. The press releases, the approved photographs, the managed access, the specific occasions of the public engagement whose character and whose content and whose available photographs were the available photographs of the managed occasion rather than the unmanaged one. The managed occasion. This is the central mechanism of the Kensington Palace communications operation, and the specific mechanism that the previous communications operations of the British royal family had been deploying across the century of the modern constitutional monarchy. The managed occasion is the occasion that the institution creates as the available public engagement and that produces, from the creation of the available public engagement, the specific content that the institution wants the public engagement to produce. The photograph of the Duchess crouching to talk to a child at the children's hospital, the photograph of the Duchess in the coat and the heels at the charity gala, the photograph of the Duchess at the Remembrance Day service with the poppy. Each photograph was the photograph of the managed occasion, the occasion whose specific management had produced the specific photograph that the specific occasion was created to produce. Diana had not had the managed occasion in the same form. Diana had had the managed occasion in the formal sense, the official visit, the charity appearance, the specific institutional engagement whose content the palace had been organizing. But Diana had also had the unmanaged occasion in the specific form that the unmanaged occasion takes, when the person inside the institution is conducting the private life in the available form of the person whose private life the institution has not fully managed into the institutional requirement. Diana's private life had been productive of the unmanaged content. The photographs and the accounts and the specific available material of the person whose interior was available for the public record in ways that the institution's management had been unable to prevent. Catherine did not produce the unmanaged content, or rather, she produced it in substantially smaller quantities than Diana had produced it, and in substantially less damaging forms, because the decade of the formation had produced in Catherine the specific quality of the person who has learned to manage the available interior in the specific form of the managed public presence rather than the unmanaged private expression. The decade of the formation meeting the institutional machine was the combination that produced the image operation. The formation was Catherine's contribution. The machine was the institution's contribution. The combination produced the image that the combination was organized around producing. Jason Knauf was the communications secretary. He was an American, which was itself an unusual appointment for the British royal family's communications operation. The American in the role traditionally occupied by the British former diplomat or former civil servant. He had worked at the Royal Bank of Scotland before joining the Kensington Palace household in 2015. He was specific in his approach and systematic in his method, and he was described by the people who worked with him as the person who understood the available media landscape of the mid-2010s in the form that the media landscape required to be understood when the media landscape was the media landscape of the social media era rather than the media landscape of the traditional press. The social media era had changed the available tools of the image operation. The image operation of the pre-social media era was the image operation of the managed press release and the organized photograph call and the specific institutional access granted to the specific institutional press. The image operation of the social media era was the image operation of the direct communication to the audience in the available form of the social media post and the official Instagram and the specific curated content of the institutional account. Kensington Palace's Instagram was launched in 2015. It was, from its inception, the most precisely curated available royal social media presence. The photographs that appeared on the official Instagram were the photographs of the managed occasion in the specific form that the managed occasion takes in the social media era, the images that were produced by the palace's own photographer or by photographers whose access had been granted and whose content had been approved before the publishing rather than after. The captions were the captions of the institutional statement, warm but measured, personal but controlled, specific but managed in the direction of the personal that the institution wanted to be available for the personal engagement, rather than the personal that the personal engagement actually contains. The personal that the institution wanted to be available. This is the specific mechanism of the image operations management of the person whose image it is managing. The institution identifies the personal that it wants to be available. The Kate who loves tennis and whose children make her laugh and who bakes with them at Christmas and who cries at the Chelsea Flower Show, and produces the available content in the form of that personal. The available content produces the public persona. The public persona is the image. She was not performing the image. This is the thing that the critical accounts of the image operation consistently get wrong. The coldness theory, the theory of the Scobie anonymous source who said she could be cold if she didn't like someone, is the theory that requires the performance of the warmth and the coldness beneath it. The theory requires the gap between the performed and the authentic. The gap between the performed and the authentic is the gap of the person who is performing rather than the person who is managing. The managing is different from the performing. The performing is the conscious production of the false version of the self for the available audience. The managing is the conscious management of which version of the authentic self is available for the available audience. Both involve selection. The performing selects the false. The managing selects the true but partial. She was managing the true but partial. The warmth with the child at the hospital was real warmth. The tennis enthusiasm was real enthusiasm. The love for her children was real love. But these were the selected dimensions of the authentic, the dimensions that the machine had identified as the dimensions to make available, and that she had selected as the dimensions she was willing to make available, in the available institutional form of the managed occasion. The dimensions that were not available were the dimensions that were not made available. Not because they were false, because they were not selected. The selecting of what is available and what is not available is the coldness that the Scobie source identified as the coldness. The cold if she doesn't like someone is not the cold of the person who has no warmth. It is the cold of the person who has decided that the warmth is not available to the person she has decided should not have the warmth. The deciding is the managing. The managing is not the cold. But the cold is what the managed unavailability feels like from the outside. This is the specific character of the image operations product in the person who is inside it. The image operation does not produce the cold. The image operation produces the selection. The selection produces the availability of the warm. The warmth's availability produces the specific perception of the warmth, and the warmth's unavailability, the cold, produces the specific perception of the cold. Both are the product of the selection. Neither is the accurate assessment of the person doing the selecting. What the machine also produced was the specific management of the available staff. The staff of the Kensington Palace household were the people whose function was the function of the people who managed the day-to-day operations of the institutional household, the private secretary, and the assistant private secretary, and the communications officer, and the personal assistant, and the stylist, and the equerry, and the specific variety of the professional functions that the institutional household of the future king and the future queen requires. The staff were inside the machine. The staff understood the machine. The staff were the machine's daily operators. The staff's relationship to the managed occasion was the relationship of the people who produce the managed occasion, rather than the people who attend the managed occasion. They were the people who organized the logistics and coordinated the access and prepared the briefings and managed the communications and ensured that the managed occasion produced the managed content, that the managed content was organized around producing. They were the production team. She was the principal. The principal's relationship to the production team was the relationship of the person who is being produced rather than the person who is producing. This is not the disempowering relationship. In the Kensington Palace household, it was the relationship of the collaborative management of the shared institutional function. She was involved. She was, by all accounts of the people who worked with her, deeply involved in the management of her own image, in the specific form of the person who has been managing her own image since before the institution existed to manage it. The involvement was real. The specific decisions, the outfit choices, the engagement selections, the charity connections, the specific content of the public presence were decisions in which she was substantively involved rather than passively compliant. The image was not the machine's image applied to the passive principle. The image was the machine's production of the principle's own management of the self in the institutional form that the machine made available. The combination was the combination, the formation and the machine. The decade of the self-produced managing and the institutional apparatus of the professional communications operation. The combination produced the image. The image was the combination's product. The press received the image in the form of the combination's product. The image was warm and controlled and precisely turned out and never a foot wrong, and the children and the coat and the heels and the charity appearances and the Wimbledon box and the Remembrance Day poppy. It was the most successfully sustained image in the modern British monarchy. More sustained than Diana's. Diana's had lasted approximately 3 years before the cracks became visible in the form of the Morton book. More sustained than the Queen's in the specific public image sense. The Queen's public image had been the image of the institution rather than the image of the person. Catherine's was the image of the person, and it was sustained across 13 years without a visible crack. Then January 2024 arrived. The planned abdominal surgery. The announcement that was not quite the full announcement. The recovery period that was longer than it was being described as. The 8 weeks of the absence. The speculation that the machine had not been designed to handle. The specific speculation of the era of the social media and the TikTok and the internet sleuth. And the collective real-time analysis of the available information that the available information was producing in the specific form of the absence of the available information. The machine had been designed to manage the available information. The machine had not been designed to manage the absence of the available information in the era in which the absence of the available information is itself information, is itself the content that the available analytical tools of the social media era are organized around producing from the absence. The machine reached for the available tool. The available tool was the photograph. The photograph was March 10, 2024. The photograph was killed within 5 hours. Rebecca Deacon had been Kate's press secretary since 2012. She stayed for 5 years. When she left in the summer of 2017, the departure was managed in the available institutional form of the departure that the institution manages in the available form. The warm statement, the expressions of gratitude, the best wishes for the future. She was getting married. She left to get married. Kate and William attended the wedding, which took place at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. The venue was the institutional endorsement of the departure. the most intimate available royal gesture extended to the person who was leaving. She has not spoken publicly about her time at Kensington Palace in any substantive form since leaving. Not the book, not the interview, not the account of the 5 years of managing the press communications of the Duchess of Cambridge across the period that included the births of Prince George and Princess Charlotte and the Caribbean tour, and the specific media landscape of the mid-2010s royal press. None of it. 5 years. Available in the public record in the form of the warm institutional statement and the chapel royal wedding and the silence. Rebecca Priestley had been Kate's private secretary before Catherine Quinn. She served for 10 years. She left in 2017, the same year as Rebecca Deacon, the same warm statement, the same expressions of gratitude, the same silence. 2 senior staff members, each having served for approximately a decade, leaving in the same year, each departing to the warm statement and the silence. Catherine Quinn arrived in October 2017, taking over from Rebecca Priestley. She lasted 2 years. She officially resigned in November 2019 and left after Christmas. The departure was described in the Daily Mail at the time as unusual. The word unusual was doing specific work in that sentence. Unusual because the role of private secretary to the Duchess of Cambridge was described in the same coverage as a plum position, a highly coveted and highly paid role that private secretaries can often stay in for a decade or more. 2 of the 3 previous occupants had stayed for approximately a decade. Catherine Quinn stayed for 2 years. The departure was unusual. The Daily Mail said so, and then the coverage moved on. Quinn left to pursue charitable work. She has not spoken publicly about her time at Kensington Palace in any substantive form. No interview about the 2 years. No account of what the unusual departure from the plum position that private secretaries typically hold for a decade produced as the available reason. The warm statement, the charitable work, the silence. Sophie Agnew had worked for Kate for 7 years. She was a close aide, one of those figures who appears in the background of the paparazzi photographs, the person who is always slightly behind the principal and slightly to the side, who carries the things that need carrying and manages the logistics that need managing, and who is present in the daily institutional life of the person she is working for, in the form of the presence whose consistency the 7 years had established as the institutional relationship. In 2019, Sophie Agnew got married. She came back from her honeymoon. She found out she was being made redundant. Friends described themselves to the Daily Mail as shocked. It seemed extreme cost-cutting. The role, a senior-level source told the outlet, had been made redundant as a result of the split of the 2 households. The split of the 2 households was the split between the Cambridge and Sussex households. She will not be replaced, the source added. A person who had worked closely with Kate for 7 years, who had been sufficiently trusted to appear in the background of the paparazzi photographs across the international tours and the major occasions of those 7 years, found out she was redundant when she returned from her honeymoon. This too was managed in the form of the institutional management, the redundancy, the source's explanation, the she will not be replaced, and then the silence. Hannah Cockburn-Logie became Kate's private secretary in May 2020. She was a career diplomat. She had spent more than 20 years in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and had received an OBE in 2017 for her work fostering Britain's relationship with India. She had impressed Kate when, as a diplomat at the British High Commission in India, she had led the Duke and Duchess's tour of India and Bhutan in 2016. She knew them. She had worked with them before the appointment. She was, by all available descriptions, exactly the kind of person who would be expected to stay for the decade that the previous holders of the role had stayed for. She left in autumn 2022, 2.5 years. A Kensington Palace source described her departure as having occurred for personal reasons. Hannah is a fantastic, dynamic leader, loyal and a skilled diplomat, the source said. She would be hugely missed. The fantastic and the dynamic and the loyal and the skilled. The would be hugely missed. And the personal reasons. The personal reasons is the available institutional language for the departure whose reason has been managed in the direction of the not disclosed. Personal reasons is what the institution says when the reason is the reason that requires the not disclosed rather than the disclosed. The warmth of the description, fantastic, dynamic, loyal, skilled, is the institution's management of the departure in the form that communicates the goodwill toward the departing person without providing the available reason for the departure. She left 2.5 years into what was expected to be the decade. Personal reasons, hugely missed. She has not spoken publicly about her time at Kensington Palace in any substantive form. Then came Alison Caulfield. Alison Caulfield was described in the initial coverage of her appointment as the Princess of Wales's new private secretary, as loud and a ballbuster. These are not the usual terms in which the appointment of a senior royal household member is described. The loud and the ballbuster were the terms of the coverage that anticipated the appointment, the briefing from the sources who had been told about the appointment before it was formally announced, and who had described the incoming private secretary in the terms that the description required. She had worked for Jamie Oliver for 5 years as his head of campaigns, driving down childhood obesity. She had the credentials, she had the profile. She had been announced, essentially, to the world that watches such announcements. She never started. The Telegraph was the newspaper that had the story. The headline that the Telegraph initially published was the headline that the story required when the story was the story of the new private secretary's decision not to take the job. Princess of Wales's new private secretary rejects job, opting to stay with Jamie Oliver. The headline then changed. The new headline read, Princess of Wales's new private secretary rejects job to stay under the radar. The same story. The same departure from the available position. The same Alison Caulfield choosing not to take the role at Kensington Palace and choosing instead to remain in the available alternative. But the first headline named the alternative. The Jamie Oliver office was the preferred destination over the Kensington Palace private secretary role. The second headline removed the alternative and replaced it with the anodyne characterization of the person who wants to stay under the radar. The palace had made a call. The Telegraph's headline had changed after, as Sella Bitchy noted at the time, presumably a bitching out from Kensington Palace. The specifically relevant dimension of the changed headline is the dimension that the change itself establishes. The first headline was the accurate account of the available story. A qualified, senior professional had been offered the role of private secretary to the Princess of Wales, and had looked at the available options, and had chosen to remain with a celebrity chef's office. The second headline converted that story into the story of the person who wants to keep a lower profile, which is a different and considerably less revealing account of the same decision. What the palace had been managing, in the call that changed the headline, was the specific implication of the first headline's accurate account. The implication was that someone had assessed the Kensington Palace household from the outside, with the professional knowledge of the senior communications professional who has been offered the inside position, and had chosen not to take it. This is not the same implication as the implication of the person who wants to stay under the radar. The stay under the radar implies a personal preference for a quieter life. The chose Jamie Oliver over Kensington Palace implies a professional assessment of the two available options. The palace preferred the personal preference reading. The personal preference reading was the reading that the changed headline produced. The palace managed the headline. Alison Caulfield never started. She too did not speak publicly about the decision. And then there was Natasha Archer. Natasha Archer, Tash, had been with Kate since 2010, 15 years. She had joined as a personal assistant to both Kate and William in the year of the engagement. She had stayed through the engagement and the wedding and the 3 children and the international tours and the cancer diagnosis and the cancer treatment and the phased return to duties. 15 years of the daily institutional life of the person she was working for. She was promoted in 2022 to Senior Private Executive Assistant. The promotion was described in royal circles at the time as a reward for her loyalty. A source said that the appointment meant we could expect to see Natasha by Kate's side for years to come. She was awarded the Royal Victorian Order in 2019. Prince William personally placed the medal. 15 years. The medal. The reward for loyalty that would produce the years to come. She left in July 2025. The reason was the private consultancy she was setting up. The Wales household issued the warm statement. The Prince and Princess of Wales household has wished Natasha the very best for the exciting opportunities ahead. Archer gave one interview to The Telegraph, in which she said that working for the Wales family had been an extraordinary privilege. She had made incredible friendships there. She looked back on her memories totally fondly. She felt really grateful to have had that opportunity. The extraordinary privilege, and the incredible friendships, and the totally fondly, and the really grateful. The interview produced the extraordinary privilege, and the totally fondly, and the silence that the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly contains between the lines. The 15 years of the daily institutional life of the person she had been working for, compressed into the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly, not because the 15 years contains nothing more specific than the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly, but because the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly is the available form of the 15 years that the available form permits. She also said, in the same interview, that she often gets referred to as a stylist, and it's quite frustrating. There are a lot of other things that came with my role. The quite frustrating is the specific emotional content that the interview permitted into the available public record. The frustration at the reduction of 15 years of the institutional service to the single available designation of the stylist who picked the clothes. The quite frustrating was the available content. The 15 years was what contained the quite frustrating as the available content. The rest was the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly. She too did not speak in any substantive form about the specific character of the 15 years. Not the private secretary who left after 2 years from the plum position that private secretaries typically hold for a decade. Not the aide made redundant on her return from her honeymoon after 7 years. Not the qualified professional who chose Jamie Oliver over the role. Not the loyal diplomat who left for personal reasons after 2.5 years. Not the 15-year assistant who produced the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly. The silence is consistent. The silence is across every departure. The silence is the specific available form of the departure from the Kensington Palace household, in the form that the departure takes when the departure has been managed by the institution in the direction of the silence. The institution manages the departures. The departures produce the silence. The silence is the machine's management of the available account of the people who have been inside the machine and who are now outside it. This is not the account that the departures are cold. The departures are warm. The statements are warm. The medal was placed by William personally. The wedding was at the Chapel Royal. The extraordinary privilege is the extraordinary privilege. The warmth of the departure is real, in the specific sense that the warmth of the institutional management of the departure is real. But the warmth of the institutional management of the departure is the warmth of the departure that has been managed. The managed warmth produces the warm statement. The warm statement produces the silence. The silence is the machine's product. Nobody has said anything about what it is actually like inside the machine. Nobody has said anything about what the principle at the center of the machine is actually like when the machine is not producing the managed content. Nobody has said anything about the quite frustrating in the form that would allow the quite frustrating to be the starting point of the account, rather than the end point of the available permitted content. They have produced the extraordinary privilege, and the totally fondly, and the silence. The silence is louder than anything they could have said. The source appears in Omid Scobie's Endgame, published in November 2023. The book is organized around the Sussex perspective. Scobie had been the journalist most consistently identified with the Sussex position across the preceding years, and Endgame was the continuation of that position in the form of the critical examination of the institution from the specific angle of the people who had left it and who had found it wanting. The book dedicated a chapter to Kate. The chapter called her Katie Keane. The Katie Keane was the nickname that Scobie said palace aides used for the Princess of Wales. The palace press office, Scobie wrote, hides her so-called lower workload by saying she is keen to learn. The keen to learn is the available language of the institutional communications professional, who is managing the available explanation for the available workload, in the direction of the explanation that makes the available workload available, as the evidence of the diligence, rather than the evidence of the not working. And then the source. A source told Scobie that Kate can be cold if she doesn't like someone. Scobie added, "This is a side of Kate that rarely gets written about. Cold if she doesn't like someone." The sentence is 11 words. The sentence is the only specific characterization of Kate's private character in the form of the negative that the available biographical record has produced from a named individual or a sourced account. Everything else in the available record is the warm statement and the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly and the Tom Quinn staff accounts that describe her as very warm, calm, and kind. Cold if she doesn't like someone is the 11 words that the title of this account and the broader public conversation about Kate's private character has been organized around. And the honest examination of the 11 words requires the honest examination of the specific source of the 11 words and the specific context in which the 11 words appear. The specific source is anonymous. The 11 words are the 11 words of the anonymous source in the pro-Sussex book, whose specific editorial position is the position that the institution and its members had treated the Sussexes badly, and whose chapter on Kate is organized around the evidence for the position that Kate had not been the warm, supportive friend and future sister-in-law that the public image of Kate had been producing as the available content. The cold if she doesn't like someone is the evidence for the position that the chapter is making. The evidence for the position is the anonymous source. The anonymous source's characterization is cold if she doesn't like someone. This is not the dismissal of the characterization. The anonymous source may be accurate. The available record does not permit the certainty either way. What the available record does permit is the honest examination of the characterization in the specific context of the sourcing. The anonymous source in the book, with the specific editorial position that requires the evidence the characterization provides. The specific editorial context is the context that the honest examination requires to be acknowledged, rather than the context that the coverage of the characterization has been managing in the direction of the acknowledgement-free deployment of the cold, if she doesn't like someone, as the established fact about Kate Middleton's private character. What else did the chapter say? The chapter said that Kate's workload had been lower than the other senior royals, and that the palace communications operation had been managing the available explanation for the lower workload in the direction of the keen-to-learn narrative. The Katie Keen nickname was the satirical shorthand for the specific management of the available explanation. The workload question is a real question. The engagement numbers that the available data has produced are the engagement numbers that the honest examination of the workload question requires to be examined. In 2023, Kate carried out 92 official engagements, 92 in a full year. The Royal Engagement League table that was assembled from the available data in late 2023 ranked her tied 8th, alongside the Duchess of Gloucester and behind the Duke of Gloucester, who is not among the most prominent available members of the royal family. Princess Anne, who topped the table for the third year running, carried out 212 engagements in the same year. King Charles carried out 197. The specific comparison between the 212 of Princess Anne and the 92 of Kate is the comparison that the engagement numbers produce when the engagement numbers are the numbers being examined. But the examination of the engagement numbers requires the honest examination of the context that the engagement numbers exist in. Kate had 3 children at the ages of 10, 8, and 5 in 2023. The 3 children at those ages are the context that the 92 exists in, the context of the mother who has identified the specific balance of the institutional function and the parental function that the institutional function and the parental function together require when the 3 children at those ages are the available parental context. She had also been described in available sources, including the Tatler cover story of 2020, as working as hard as a top CEO who has to be wheeled out all the time without the benefits of boundaries and plenty of holidays. The as hard as a top CEO is the characterization of the person who has been presented publicly as the lighter workload and whose private experience of the available workload is the experience of the person who is, in the private form of the experience, managing the institutional function in the form of the CEO rather than the form of the part-time royal. The Tatler story is the story whose examination produces its own complications. The 2020 Tatler cover was the Catherine the Great cover. The cover was organized around the specific narrative of Kate's increased responsibilities following the Sussex departure and the specific sources who described Kate as furious about the larger workload and exhausted and trapped and feeling like she is working as hard as a top CEO. The palace's response to the Tatler story was the response that the palace produces when the Tatler story is the Tatler story that the palace has decided requires the institutional response. The palace said, "This story contains a swathe of inaccuracies and false misrepresentations which were not put to Kensington Palace prior to publication." The swathe of inaccuracies and false misrepresentations. The strong language of the institutional denial, stronger than the typical palace not commenting. The Tatler editor responded to the palace's denial with the specific counter that the Tatler editor produces when the palace denies the Tatler story that the Tatler editor knows to be accurate. Kensington Palace knew we were running the Catherine the Great cover months ago, and we asked them to work together on it. The fact they are denying they ever knew is categorically false. Categorically false. The Tatler editor called the palace's denial categorically false. The palace said the story contained a swathe of inaccuracies. Both the palace and the Tatler editor were deploying the available language of the institution and the publication respectively in the available form of the public disagreement about the available account. What was in the story that produced this specific public disagreement? Kate is furious about the larger workload. Of course she's smiling and dressing appropriately, but she doesn't want this. She feels exhausted and trapped. And she's working as hard as a top CEO who has to be wheeled out all the time without the benefits of boundaries and plenty of holidays. The exhausted and trapped, and the top CEO, and the wheeled out all the time. These are the characterizations of the person who is experiencing the institutional function in the private form of the person whose private experience of the institutional function is the experience of the exhaustion rather than the experience of the fulfillment. They are not the characterizations of the cold person. They are the characterizations of the person who is performing the institutional function in the form of the managed public warmth, while privately experiencing the exhaustion and the trapping of the person who is in the machine. The machine produces the managed warmth. The managed warmth produces the public image. The public image requires the performance of the managed warmth at the official level that the 92 engagements requires. And behind the performance of the managed warmth at the 92 engagement level, the private person is exhausted and trapped and furious about the larger workload and feels like the CEO who is being wheeled out all the time without the benefits of boundaries and holidays. This is not the cold. This is the managed warmth's cost. The managed warmth has a cost. The cost is what the private person experiences when the performance of the managed warmth is the available function of the institutional role. The exhausted and the trapped and the furious are the cost of the managed warmth's performance in the 92 engagement year. The Scobie characterization and the Tatler characterization are pointing at the same thing from different angles. The cold, if she doesn't like someone, is the characterization from the angle of the person who has encountered the managed warmth's withdrawal, the person who is not one of the people that the managed warmth is available for. The exhausted and trapped and furious is the characterization from the angle of the person whose experience of the institutional function is the experience of the managed warmth's production cost. Both are pointing at the managing, not the cold, not the warmth, the managing. The managing is the formation's product. The Downe House survival and the Marlborough recovery and the 10 years of the careful and the simply present had produced the managing as the organizing principle. The managing produces the warmth where the warmth is required. The managing produces the unavailability, the cold, where the managed warmth is not deployed. The managing produces the exhaustion when the managed warmth has been deployed at 92 engagements in a year, where the children are 10, 8, and 5. The managing is what the 11 words from the anonymous Scobie source and the Tatler's exhausted and trapped are both describing. They are describing it from the outside position of the person who has encountered the managing in the specific form that the managing takes from the outside. The cold of the not deployed warmth, or the trapped of the deployed warmth's cost. The inside position is the position of the person who is managing. The inside position does not produce the available account. The inside position produces the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly and the quite frustrating. The extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly and the quite frustrating is the managing from the inside, made available in the only form that the departing staff member permits, the warm statement and the silence, and the single quite frustrating that the silence contains. There is one more characterization. Scobie wrote, advocating for mental health causes, the mental health of mothers, for that matter, but ignoring her own sister-in-law's cries for help, seemed out of character for someone the public knew as sweet and easy to get along with. The ignoring her own sister-in-law's cries for help is the characterization of the Kate-Meghan relationship from the Sussex position. The Sussex position is the position that Endgame is organized around. The ignoring is the specific claim that Kate had not intervened when Meghan was experiencing the specific mental health difficulties that Meghan had described in the Oprah interview and elsewhere. The not intervening, in the Sussex position's framing, is the evidence of the cold, the person who advocates publicly for the thing she does not practice privately. The honest examination of the not intervening claim requires the honest examination of what the intervening would have required in the specific institutional context of the Kensington Palace of 2018 and 2019. The institutional context was the context of the two households, the Cambridge household and the Sussex household, whose management was the management of the two separate institutional operations rather than the management of the single institutional operation that the single household had been before the Sussex departure. The two households were managing the two separate institutional operations. The intervention in the other household's private affairs was not the available function of the other household's management. This is not the excuse for the not intervening. This is the institutional context of the not intervening. Whether the institutional context was the cause of the not intervening, or whether the cold of the Scobie sauce was the cause of the not intervening, is the question that the available evidence does not resolve. What the available evidence establishes is the following. The cold characterization comes from one anonymous source in one pro-Sussex book. The exhausted and trapped characterization comes from anonymous Tatler sources, whose account the Palace denied, and the Tatler editor said the Palace's denial of was categorically false. The entirely separate Tom Quinn accounts from Palace staff say she is very warm, calm, and kind. The departing staff produce the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly and the silence. Cold is not the accurate word. Managed is the accurate word. And managed is considerably more interesting than cold, because the managed contains the formation and the machine and the selecting of the available warmth and the cost of the selecting and the exhausted and the trapped and the quite frustrating and the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly. Cold is empty. Managed is full. The full story is the story of the managed, and the managed story is the story that none of the departing staff have fully told. In the spring of 2019, a rumor began circulating in the specific social world of the British aristocracy that connects the royal family to the landed gentry of the English countryside. The rumor concerned William and a woman named Rose Hanbury. Rose Hanbury is the Marchioness of Cholmondeley. She is married to David Rocksavage, the Marquis of Cholmondeley, who is the Lord Great Chamberlain of England, one of the most senior ceremonial positions in the British constitutional order. Rose had been a model. She had appeared on the cover of Tatler. She and her husband lived at Houghton Hall in Norfolk, which is the 18th century estate that sits approximately 6 miles from Sandringham, where the Wales family spends significant portions of the year. The proximity to Sandringham had made Rose and her husband natural members of the Sandringham social circle, the specific group of the landed and the titled whose estates and houses cluster around the royal family's Norfolk residence and who therefore become the available social world of the royal family's private Norfolk life. Kate had been friendly with Rose. They had been photographed together. The friendship was the friendship of the Sandringham circle, the specific social world that the proximity to Sandringham and the shared membership of the Norfolk landed gentry's social world produces as the available friendship for the person who is at Sandringham and who has the available social world that the Sandringham adjacency generates. The rumor was that William had been having an affair with Rose. The rumour was not published in the British press in the spring of 2019 in the form that the rumour requires to be published when the rumour is the rumour whose publication the press has decided requires the specific assessment of the available legal risk that the publication of the rumour about the heir to the throne's private life produces as the available legal risk. The British press did not publish the rumour. The rumour circulated in the specific social world. The social world circulated it in the available form of the social world's circulation of the things that the available form of the social world's circulation produces. Then William's lawyers sent letters. The letters were the legal letters of the person whose lawyers have identified in the available public discourse the specific material that the lawyers have concluded requires the legal intervention in the form of the letter rather than the formal litigation. The letters were sent to a number of British newspapers and publishers. The letters did not confirm the rumour. The letters threatened legal action if the rumour was published. The specific legal letters threatening the specific publications that had been considering publishing the rumour were the most visible evidence that the rumour existed in the form that required the legal letters. Because the legal letters from the lawyers of the heir to the throne are not the available tool deployed against the rumour that does not exist in the form that requires the deployment of the available legal tool. The legal letters were the available institutional management of the available information in the specific form of the legal prevention rather than the institutional statement. They worked. The British press did not publish the rumour in the available British publications in the spring of 2019 in the form that the legal letters had been sent to prevent. The American press published it. The American tabloid press, which operates outside the jurisdiction of the legal letter's specific legal reach, published the rumour in the form that the American tabloid press publishes the rumours that the British press has been legally prevented from publishing. The American publication of the rumour was the available form of the publication of the thing that the legal letters had been organised around, preventing from being available in the British press. And so the rumour was in the American press and not in the British press, and the legal letters had produced the specific outcome of the managed absence of the rumour from the British press, while the rumour's presence in the American press made the managed absence of the rumour from the British press the evidence of the managed absence rather than the genuine absence. Kate's response was visible. She and William arrived separately at a Christmas event hosted by the Queen. They arrived in separate cars. The separate cars in the specific context of the available rumours and the available legal letters and the available American press publication were the separate cars whose specific significance the available coverage was organised around, examining in the terms of the available significance. A palace spokesperson was asked about the separate cars. The spokesperson said that things had been taken out of context and that Prince William was required to be there half an hour earlier than the others. Half an hour earlier than the others. The available explanation for the separate cars was the scheduling explanation. The heir was required to be at the occasion earlier than his wife, and therefore travelled separately. The scheduling explanation is the available explanation whose availability the palace spokesperson deployed in the specific form of the available explanation when the available explanation was required. Whether the scheduling explanation was the accurate explanation for the separate cars is the question that the available sources have not resolved with the certainty that the resolution would require. What is established is the separate cars and the scheduling explanation and the managed absence of the British press coverage and the American press publication and the legal letters and the rumours in the Sandringham social circle. In 2021, 2 years after the spring of 2019, reports emerged that William had renewed contact with Rose Hanbury. The renewed contact was the reports, the available form of the reports that the available sources had produced in the available form of the reports. The renewal of the contact was reported alongside the specific detail that Kate was angered by William, including Rose Hanbury's name on their Christmas card list. The Christmas card list, the specific social gesture of the Christmas card list, producing the specific reported response of the anger. The Christmas card list and the anger at the Christmas card list are the available public content of the 2021 reports. They are not the confirmed content. They are the reported content of the available sources who produced the reports in the available form. The palace did not comment on the reports. The palace did not confirm. The palace did not deny. The palace managed the reports in the available form of the not commenting. Kate did not comment. Kate managed the not commenting in the available form of the not commenting that the 10 years of the formation and the decade of the managed public presence and the machine's discipline had produced as the available response to the thing that is managed through the not commenting. The not commenting is the managed response to the thing that the managed response manages through the not commenting. The thing that requires the managed not commenting is the thing whose commenting would be more damaging than the not commenting. The specific thing that the not commenting was managing, whether the rumors were accurate, and what Kate's private experience of the rumors was, and what the separate cars actually meant, and what the anger at the Christmas card list actually contained, was the thing that the managed not commenting was organized around, preventing from becoming the available public content. The managed not commenting is the managed public presence in its most precise available form, the management of the private through the public absence of the private. The public absence of the private is what the formation had produced across 10 years of the careful and the simply present. The public absence of the private is what the machine had been managing in the institutional form across the years of the managed occasions and the approved photographs and the direct Instagram communications. The Rose-Hanbury dimension is the dimension that most precisely reveals the specific quality of the managed public presence in the form that the managed public presence takes when the managed public presence is managing the most damaging available private account. The most damaging available private account is not the cold of the SCOBY sauce. The most damaging available private account is the rumor of the husband's affair with the neighbor in the Sandringham social circle. The managed public presence managed it. The legal letters managed the British press. The not commenting managed the American press's publication. The scheduling explanation managed the separate cars. The palace's silence managed the 2021 Christmas card reports. The managed public presence produced the managed public absence of the thing that the managed public presence was managing. And on the other side of the managed public absence, in the private form of the person who is managing the managed public absence of the most damaging available private account, Kate was there, living, managing. The formation did not produce the cold. The formation produced the managed. And the managed was managing the Rose-Hanbury dimension in the specific form that the managed manages the things whose managing is the available function. The available function was the smile, the coat and the heels, the children's charity appearance, the mental health advocacy, the Wimbledon box, the Remembrance Day poppy. The managed warmth produced in the available form of the managed occasions at the 92 engagement rate of the year, with 3 children at 10, 8, and 5. She was managing all of it. Behind the managing was everything that the managing was managing. The Rose-Hanbury dimension was part of everything that the managing was managing. This is not the sympathy framing. The sympathy framing would require the presentation of Kate as the victim of the managing's requirement, the person who was managing the Rose-Hanbury dimension through the managed public presence, and who deserves the available sympathy of the person who is managing the most damaging available private account in the form of the managed public presence. The honest assessment requires something more complicated than the sympathy framing. The honest assessment requires the acknowledgement that the managing of the Rose-Hanbury dimension through the managed public presence was the managing that the formation and the machine together had produced as the available response. That it was the response that the formation had been producing across the decades of the careful and the not performing and the simply present, and that the machine had been deploying as the institutional management of the available content. The managed not commenting was the formation's product meeting the machine's deployment. The formation and the machine had been producing the managed not commenting together for 13 years. The Rose-Hanbury dimension was the managed not commenting's most significant available test. The managed not commenting passed the test in the British press, in the palace statements, in the Instagram posts and the charity appearances, and the managed occasions that continued to produce the managed content throughout and beyond the spring of 2019 and the 2021 Christmas card reports. She smiled at Wimbledon. She crouched to speak to children at the charity appearances. She wore the coat and the heels at the official engagements. The managed warmth was available in the managed occasions. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel going, and I read every single comment. Drop one below, telling me where in the world you are watching from. The managed, not commenting, managed it. What it could not manage was cancer. On the 17th of January, 2024, Kensington Palace released a statement. The statement said that the Princess of Wales had been admitted to hospital for planned abdominal surgery. The surgery had taken place. It had been successful. She was likely to remain in hospital for 10 to 14 days and would then return home to continue her recovery. Based on current medical advice, she was unlikely to return to public duties until after Easter. The statement was 4 sentences. The statement was managed in the available institutional form of the statement that the institution releases when the institution is required to release a statement about the health of a member of the household and has decided to release the specific information that the statement releases rather than the specific information that the statement does not release. What the statement released: planned, abdominal, surgery, successful, 10 to 14 days, return home, Easter. What the statement did not release: the specific medical condition that required the surgery, the specific nature of the abdominal surgery, the specific reasons why the surgery was planned, the specific prognosis, the specific timeline of the recovery beyond the Easter return to public duties. Planned abdominal surgery. The phrase is the phrase of the managed institutional statement, the phrase that is accurate in the specific sense that the surgery was planned, and that it was abdominal, and that it was surgery, and that does not extend beyond the accurate in the specific sense that it does not provide the information that the accurate would provide if the accurate were the account of the specific medical condition rather than the description of the category of the intervention. The machine released the planned abdominal surgery. The planned abdominal surgery was the available content that the machine had decided was the available content. The rest was the managed absence, the absence of the specific medical condition from the available content. The managed absence of the specific medical condition from the available content was the managed absence that produced the specific problem. The specific problem was the 2024 information environment. The 2024 information environment was not the information environment that the managed absence of the planned abdominal surgery had been designed for. The managed absence had been designed for the information environment of the pre-social media era, the information environment in which the managed absence of the specific information is the managed absence that the press receives as the managed absence and manages in the form that the managed absence requires from the press, whose relationship to the palace is the relationship organized around the managed account. The 2024 information environment was not organized around the managed account in the form that the managed account required. The 2024 information environment was organized around TikTok and Instagram and X and the Reddit threads, and the specific analytical culture of the internet sleuth, who receives the managed absence, not as the managed absence that the press receives, as the managed absence, but as the specific content that the absence itself provides, when the absence is the absence of the most prominent woman in Britain from the available public record. The absence is content. In the 2024 information environment, the absence is content in the specific form that the absence produces the available speculation from the available analytical tools of the collective real-time examination of the managed absence. The managed absence of the planned abdominal surgery provided the space that the available speculation required. The available speculation moved in. The speculation moved in with the specific energy of the 2024 information environment, the TikTok videos and the Reddit threads and the Instagram posts and the X commentary that assembled the available evidence of the absence in the available analytical form. What was the specific surgery? Why was there no photograph leaving hospital? Why was there no sighting at the school run? Why was the recovery period extending beyond the initial 10 to 14 days? Why was Easter receding as the available return date in the available coverage? The palace's management of the available speculation was the management that the palace deploys when the available speculation is the available speculation. the not commenting on the specific claims, and the occasional brief statement of reassurance that the not commenting is the available form of the management, and that the reassurance is the reassurance of the not specific that the available reassurance provides when the specific reassurance is not the available content. She is recovering well, she is doing well, she appreciates the support. The recovering well and the doing well and the appreciates the support are the available content of the reassurance, the specific form of the managed warmth deployed in the direction of the available public concern, without providing the specific information that the public concern was organized around requiring. The available public concern was organized around the specific information that the planned abdominal surgery had not released. The available speculation had moved in to occupy the space that the specific information's absence had produced. The recovering well and the doing well were occupying the available space of the specific reassurance, while the available speculation continued to occupy the available space of the specific information's absence. 6 weeks into the managed absence, a paparazzi photograph appeared. She was in the passenger seat of a black car near Windsor, being driven by her mother Carol. The photograph was the first available image of Kate since Christmas. It was a paparazzi photograph, not the managed photograph of the managed occasion, but the available image of the person who is in the car, being driven by her mother near Windsor, and who has been identified by the paparazzi, and whose image is now the available content of the 6-week absence. The palace did not comment on the photograph. The photograph was the available content of the 6-week absence in the form that the paparazzi photograph provides, when the paparazzi photograph is the first available image of the person who has been absent for 6 weeks. The coverage received the photograph as the evidence of the being alive and the being in the car and the being driven by the mother near Windsor. The coverage was simultaneously noting that the photograph was the only available image in 6 weeks. The machine assessed the available situation. The available situation was the situation of the 8-week absence and the growing available speculation, and the TikTok and the Reddit and the X commentary and the paparazzi car photograph and the recovering well and the doing well and the appreciates the support and the Easter return date that had become the return date, whose arrival would either confirm the recovery or require the further management. The machine had a tool. The tool was the photograph. The specific photograph was the specific tool, because the photograph had been the machine's primary available tool across the 13 years of the managed occasions and the approved photographs and the direct Instagram communications. The machine had deployed the photograph to produce the managed content in the available form of the managed occasion across 13 years. The photograph of the managed occasion had been the machine's most effective available instrument for the production of the available content in the specific form that the available content was most effectively produced. The machine deployed the photograph. The decision to release a photograph to mark UK Mother's Day on the 10th of March 2024 was the machine's deployment of the available tool in the available situation. The available situation required the content that the available tool was organized around producing. The content was the evidence of the being there, the visible presence of the Princess of Wales in the available form of the family photograph that the Mother's Day occasion provided as the available institutional occasion for the photograph. The Mother's Day photograph was the managed occasion in the specific form that the managed occasion takes when the managed occasion is the occasion that produces the managed content of the visible presence. The visible presence was the specific content that the 8 weeks of the managed absence had made the most valuable available content, more valuable than the recovering well and the doing well and the appreciates the support, which were the contents of the absence rather than the contents of the presence. The photograph was taken by William, or the photograph was credited to William. The crediting of the photograph to William was the institutional decision that the photograph was the photograph whose credit was the credit of William, the informal family photographer, rather than the professional whose involvement would have signaled the specific level of the managed occasion that the professional photographer's involvement signals. The informal family photograph. The husband taking a picture of his wife and their children at home on a Sunday morning to mark Mother's Day. This is the specific register that the photograph was organized around producing, the personal rather than the institutional, the informal rather than the formal, the family rather than the managed occasion. The personal and the informal and the family were the specific register that the machine had identified as the register whose deployment would produce the maximum available effect of the visible presence in the minimum available institutional form. The maximum visible presence in the minimum institutional form was the specific combination that the Mother's Day photograph was organized around producing. The photograph was released at approximately the time that the Mother's Day photographs are released on Mother's Day, the time of the morning when the social media post marks the occasion in the available form of the social media post that marks the occasion. It was posted to the official Instagram and the official X account of the Prince and Princess of Wales. It was issued to the major wire services for syndication. The Associated Press published it. Reuters published it. AFP published it. Getty published it. PA published it. Within 5 hours, the Associated Press killed it. The kill notice said, "At closer inspection, it appears that the source has manipulated the image in a way that did not meet AP's photo standards. The photo shows an inconsistency in the alignment of Princess Charlotte's left hand. No replacement photo will be sent." Reuters killed it. AFP killed it. Getty killed it. PA killed it. 5 wire services, within hours of each other, on the same Sunday afternoon, killed the same photograph that the machine had released as the answer to 8 weeks of the managed absence. Kensington Palace declined to comment. The declining to comment was the managed not commenting. The available institutional response when the available institutional response is the not commenting. But the not commenting on the 5 wire services simultaneously killing the official photograph of the Princess of Wales was the not commenting in the specific form that the not commenting takes when the thing being not commented on is the 5 wire services simultaneously killing the official photograph. The not commenting on that thing was the most visible possible comment on that thing. The next morning, Kate posted an apology on the official Instagram. "Like many amateur photographers, I do occasionally experiment with editing. I wanted to express my apologies for any confusion the family photograph we shared yesterday caused. I hope everyone celebrating had a very happy Mother's Day. See, the amateur photographer, the experimenting with editing, the apologies for any confusion." The managed public presence of the 13 years had produced the managed statement that the managed statement required in the available form of the personal and the informal, the C at the end of the apology, rather than the institutional third person of the usual palace statement. It was her apology. She was owning it. She was taking personal responsibility for the manipulation in the form that the personal responsibility takes when the personal responsibility is organized around the amateur photographer who experiments with editing rather than the institutional communications operation that had decided to release a manipulated photograph during the most scrutinized period of the Princess of Wales's public life. She apologized. The palace declined to comment on the specific character of the apology. Within 4 days, AFP's global news director Phil Chetwynd said in an interview that Kensington Palace was no longer considered a trusted source. The specific phrase, "no longer a trusted source," was the institutional verdict of the world's 4th largest news agency on the specific credibility of the Kensington Palace communications operation. No longer a trusted source. This was not the verdict on Kate Middleton's character. This was the verdict on the machine. The machine that had been producing the managed content for 13 years and that had produced, in the 8 weeks of the managed absence and the Mother's Day photograph and the 5 wire services kill notices and the amateur photographer apology, the specific outcome of the loss of the institutional credibility of the trusted source. The machine had been trusted for 13 years. The machine lost the trust in 5 hours. 12 days passed between the Mother's Day photograph and the cancer announcement. 12 days of the 5 wire services having killed the photograph. 12 days of AFP's global news director saying Kensington Palace was no longer a trusted source. 12 days of speculation that had not quieted but had intensified, because the kill notices had added the specific question of the manipulation to the existing question of the 8-week absence, and the 2 questions together were considerably louder than the 1 question had been. The palace press office had reached for the photograph as the tool that would answer the absence. The photograph had made the absence worse. Something different was needed. On the 22nd of March 2024, they found it. The announcement was not a statement, it was a video. 3 minutes and 25 seconds. Kate sitting on a bench on a sunny terrace at Windsor, in a blue and white striped shirt and dark jeans. No pearl earrings, no coat, no heels. Looking directly into the camera, speaking in the first person. She said, "I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your kindness and concern. As you can imagine, January and February have been incredibly difficult for our whole family. In January, I underwent major abdominal surgery in London, and at the time, it was thought that my condition was non-cancerous. The surgery was successful. However, tests after the operation found cancer had been present. My medical team therefore recommended that I start a course of preventative chemotherapy, and I am now in the early stages of that treatment." She paused. "This, of course, came as a huge shock, and William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately for the sake of our young family. As you can imagine, this has taken time. It has taken me time to recover from major surgery in order to be in a position to receive and process all this information. I started chemotherapy in late February. It has been an incredibly difficult few months for us as a family." Another pause. "I am well and getting stronger every day by spending time focusing on the things that will help me heal. In my mind, time with the family, getting outside in the fresh air, gentle exercise, and, most importantly, doing the work of the preventative chemotherapy. Then, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your continued support. I look forward to returning to work when I am able to. And above all, I am focusing on making a full and complete recovery. Thank you." 3 minutes and 25 seconds. That was the length of the announcement. The choice of video over written statement was the most important decision in that announcement. For 13 years, Kensington Palace had produced its content through the approved channels, the official photograph, the written statement, the royal correspondence briefing, the curated Instagram post. All of it filtered through the palace press office before it reached anyone. That was the system. That was how it worked. The video bypassed the system, or rather, it appeared to bypass the system while actually being the most carefully considered product the system had ever produced. Because the problem that needed solving was not a lack of information, it was a lack of trust. AFP had said so explicitly, no longer a trusted source. 4 words that described the specific damage that the Mother's Day photograph had done to the credibility of every piece of content that bore the Kensington Palace stamp. The solution to a trust problem is not a statement from the organization whose trust has been compromised. It is the person, Kate herself, in a shirt and jeans on a bench, without the coat and the heels and the pearl earrings of the official occasion, speaking in the first person to a camera on a sunny afternoon. This is not cynicism about what she said. What she said was true. The timeline she described was verifiable. In January, the surgery had taken place. At the time of the surgery, the condition was believed non-cancerous. Tests afterward found cancer. Chemotherapy began in late February. That is the sequence. That is what she said. The words were true, but the form of those words, the shirt, the jeans, the first person, the outdoor setting, the direct address, the pauses, was a decision. A decision made by the people who had spent 13 years producing content for her. The anti-institutional wrapping of the most important piece of content they had ever released was not an accident. It was the answer to the trust problem in the only register that could answer it. You cannot restore trust in an institution by issuing a statement from the institution. You restore it by removing the institution from view entirely and putting the person in its place. They put Kate in its place. The timeline she laid out also explained the 8 weeks. Not explained in the defensive sense, explained in the medical sense. The surgery was January. The cancer was found in tests after the surgery. It was not known at the time of the surgery. The January statement, planned abdominal surgery, successful, recovery period, Easter return, had been accurate based on what was known when it was released. The cancer was found afterward. The chemotherapy began in late February. The 8 weeks between the January statement and the March announcement were not 8 weeks of hiding a cancer diagnosis. They were 8 weeks of the family absorbing a cancer diagnosis that arrived after surgery they had believed to be non-cancerous. She said so directly. "It has taken me time to recover from major surgery in order to be in a position to receive and process all this information. The children needed to know before the world did. George was 10, Charlotte was 8, Louis was 5. There is an argument, perhaps the only fully defensible argument about the 8 weeks, that the sequence of the children's knowing before the public's knowing is not the argument that requires the explaining. It is the argument that is simply true. Parents in that situation tell their children first. That is not the institutional decision. That is the human one," she said. "We have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately for the sake of our young family." For the sake of our young family is the sentence that the 8 weeks of the managing privacy ultimately comes down to. Not the press management, not the reputation management, not the image protection. The children, George and Charlotte and Louis, who were 10 and 8 and 5, and who needed the time that the private processing required before the world outside their home knew what they were living with. The palace's handling of the 8 weeks was imperfect. The photograph decision was wrong. The decision to release a manipulated photograph during the most scrutinized absence of Kate's public life was the decision that cost Kensington Palace its trusted source designation, and that intensified rather than quieted the speculation it was sent to address. That was a failure, but the announcement itself, the March 22nd video, was something else. It was the specific product of the woman who had spent 13 years learning to manage her public life, being required to make the most public statement of that life about the most private thing that had happened to her. She sat on the bench, she looked at the camera, she said the words in the first person in the jeans and the blue and white shirt on the sunny afternoon. She did not reach for the managed warmth of the 92 official engagements. She did not produce the smile of the coat and the heels and the pearl earrings. She did not deploy the curated Instagram warmth of the children baking at Christmas. She said, "This of course came as a huge shock." The huge shock is the sentence that the 13 years of the never a foot wrong and the always perfectly turned out and the managed warmth of the approved photographs did not produce in the available record. The huge shock is the specific human content of the announcement, the content of the actual person rather than the curated version of the person. And the actual person was sitting on a bench in a shirt and jeans, saying, "This came as a huge shock," and she was going through chemotherapy, and she wanted to thank people for their support, and she was focusing on making a full and complete recovery. The announcement was the most honest thing Kensington Palace had produced in 13 years. Not because it was unmanaged, it was clearly considered, clearly prepared, clearly the product of people who understood exactly what register the trust problem required. But because the content of it was the content of the actual woman rather than the image of the actual woman. The image had been running for 13 years. The image had been working. The image had lost the wire services in 5 hours on a Sunday afternoon in March 2024. And 12 days after losing the wire services, the image stepped aside and the woman sat down on the bench and said, "This came as a huge shock." The cold that the SCOBY source described, the exhausted and trapped that the Tatler described, the extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly and the quite frustrating that the departing staff described. None of those accounts had cracked the image in 13 years. None of the Rose Hanbury reporting had cracked it. None of the Katie Keene allegations had cracked it. The cancer cracked it. Not because cancer makes someone more truthful, but because the cancer arrived in the sequence that it arrived in, after the surgery that was believed non-cancerous, in the middle of the 8-week absence, 12 days after the wire services had collectively decided that Kensington Palace could not be trusted, and the sequence produced the specific moment in which the only available answer was the woman herself. She sat on the bench. She said the words. She was not performing the warmth. She was not managing the image. She was sitting in the jeans and the shirt on the sunny afternoon at Windsor, going through chemotherapy, talking directly to the people who had been worried about her for 8 weeks. That was the announcement. On the 15th of June 2024, 87 days after the cancer announcement, Kate appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace for Trooping the Colour. She wore a white Catherine Walker dress. She was thinner than she had been at Christmas. She stood with William and the children, George in his Welsh Guard uniform, Charlotte in pale blue, Louis in a white shirt, and she waved at the crowd in the mall below. Louis waved at the red arrows with his whole arm, face tilted up, unbothered by anything except the aircraft. Kate watched him. A photographer caught the expression on her face in the moment between the wave and the smile. It was not the composed expression of the official occasion, it was something quieter than that. The face of a woman watching her 6-year-old in the sunshine, who had recently had reason to think very carefully about watching her 6-year-old in the sunshine. The crowd in the mall below reacted in a way that Trooping the Colour crowds do not usually react. They cheered. Not the formal coordinated applause of the scheduled moment. The spontaneous noise of 80,000 people who had been watching and waiting for 6 months, and who were now seeing the person they had been worried about, standing upright, present, smiling, her children around her, and who were responding to that in the only available way. She had not expected it to be that loud. That detail comes from the accounts of the people who observed her in the moments after the crowd reacted. She was visibly moved. Not the managed moved, not the careful expression of gratitude that the official occasion produces in the person who has been trained to receive the public warmth with the appropriate visible warmth in return. Actually moved. The kind of moved that does not produce the composed expression of the trained public figure, but the specific expression of the person who has received something they were not ready for. She cried. Not dramatically, not in the way that public crying is sometimes performed. Quietly, briefly, in the way that the person who has been holding it together for a long time cries when something they were not expecting breaks through the holding together. William reached for her hand. The crowd saw this and cheered louder. What was being witnessed on that balcony on the 15th of June 2024 was something that the previous 13 years of the Kensington Palace operation had been very specifically designed to prevent from being witnessed. Not because the palace wanted to hide Kate's humanity, but because the system that had been built around her public life was built for the managed occasion, not the unguarded moment. The unguarded moment is the moment the system does not produce. The unguarded moment arrives despite the system, or because the system has been temporarily overwhelmed by the circumstances that produce the unguarded moment. The circumstances that produce an unguarded moment on a palace balcony in June 2024 include major surgery in January, a cancer diagnosis in March, several months of chemotherapy, and the first major public appearance since any of it happened. The crowd was not reacting to the white dress. The crowd was not reacting to the composed smile and the wave of the official occasion. The crowd was reacting to the person, the specific person who had been through the specific things and who was standing there, present, alive. Watching her son wave at aeroplanes. The crowd had always liked Kate. The approval ratings had been strong across the 13 years, consistently higher than most of the royal family, occasionally approaching the levels that Diana had reached in the early years of her marriage. But approval is not the same as the specific emotional reaction that the Trooping the Colour crowd produced on the 15th of June 2024. Approval is the assessment of the public figure. What happened in the mall was something closer to relief. 6 months of the absence and the speculation and the kill notices and the amateur photographer apology and the cancer announcement had produced, in the specific public that had been watching all of it, the specific emotional investment in the outcome of the cancer and the chemotherapy and the recovery that the 6 months of watching had built. The 6 months had not been 6 months of the managed warmth of the approved photographs and the curated Instagram posts. They had been 6 months of the actual story, the surgery and the cancer and the children and the chemotherapy, and the woman sitting in the shirt and jeans on the bench at Windsor, saying this came as a huge shock. The actual story had built something that the managed warmth could not have built. The managed warmth builds approval. The actual story built investment. The crowd in the mall was not the crowd that approved of the Princess of Wales. It was the crowd that was invested in the Princess of Wales, that had been invested across 6 months of the actual story, and that was now seeing the outcome of the story they had been invested in. This is the thing that the 13 years of the curated image had not produced and could not have produced. The curated image produces the managed warmth, the warmth of the approved photograph, and the charity appearance, and the Wimbledon box, and the mental health advocacy, and the children at Christmas. The managed warmth is real warmth, but it is warmth at the distance of the managed occasion. The 6 months had collapsed the distance. When the distance collapses, when the actual story replaces the managed version of the story, the emotional response it produces is qualitatively different from the emotional response that the managed version produces. The crowd in the mall was not cheering the managed version. They were cheering the actual person who had been through the actual thing and who was standing there in the white dress, watching Louis wave at the red arrows and crying quietly when the sighs of the cheering broke through the composure she had brought to the balcony. William held her hand. The crowd cheered louder. 6 weeks later, she appeared at Wimbledon. The Wimbledon appearance on the 14th of July 2024 was different from Trooping the Colour in a specific way. Trooping the Colour was the formal royal occasion, the sovereign's birthday parade, the balcony, the flypast, the assembled members of the family in the institutional setting of the most institutional available public moment. The form of the Trooping the Colour appearance was determined by the occasion. She appeared because the occasion required the appearance. Wimbledon was a choice. Wimbledon was the occasion that Kate goes to because Kate goes to Wimbledon, because she has been going to Wimbledon in the royal box for 13 years, and because tennis is the specific enthusiasm that the managed warmth had made available as the personal detail of the curated public persona. The tennis is real, the enthusiasm is genuine, but the Wimbledon appearance had always been the appearance of the curated public persona at the occasion most associated with the curated public persona's genuine enthusiasm. The Wimbledon appearance in July 2024 was different because the person making it was different. Not the diagnosis. The diagnosis had not changed who she was, but the diagnosis had changed what the public saw when they looked at her. The distance had collapsed in June. At Wimbledon in July, there was no distance left. She walked out to the royal box in a yellow dress, and the crowd stood. Not the polite standing of the formal occasion, the standing of the crowd that is expressing something more specific than the formal respect the formal occasion requires. She smiled. She was still thinner than she had been. She looked well, by the accounts of the journalists and the photographers who were there, and who produced the accounts of what the presence looked like from the press seats. The crowd at Centre Court gave her a standing ovation. Centre Court at Wimbledon is not a crowd that gives standing ovations to the people in the royal box. It is a crowd that is there for the tennis. The tennis is the point. The royal box is the institutional backdrop to the point. The standing ovation for the person in the royal box rather than for the tennis is the standing ovation that the specific circumstances of the July 2024 Wimbledon appearance produced from the Centre Court crowd. She received it in the yellow dress. She smiled. She sat down. The tennis continued. The two appearances together, the June balcony and the July Wimbledon box, produced the specific public story of the return in a way that the previous 13 years of the managed warmth could not have produced. The managed warmth had made her popular. The cancer and the return had made her something different, had made her the public figure whose story the public had been invested in across 6 months of the actual story, and whose return from the actual story was the return that the investment had been building toward. Approval had become something warmer and more specific, something closer to the feeling the public had for Diana. Not the approval of the popular public figure, but the specific emotional connection of the people who feel they know the actual person, rather than the curated version of the person. The cold that the Scobie source had described, the Katie Keane that Endgame had named, the exhausted and trapped that Tatler had published. None of those accounts had reached the public in the form that the actual story had reached them across the 6 months. The anonymous sources and the unflattering nicknames had circulated in the coverage without ever breaking through the managed surface. The cancer had broken through it. Not because cancer is a better story than the anonymous source, but because the cancer arrived in the specific way it arrived, in the surgery and the tests and the diagnosis and the chemotherapy and the bench in the shirt and jeans and the huge shock, and landed in the public in the way that the actual story lands when the actual story is the story. The managed surface had been very good. It had held for 13 years. It had held through the Tatler and the Scobie book, and the Rose Hanbury reporting, and the Katie Keene, and the staff departures, and the extraordinary privilege, and the quite frustrating. Then the cancer came, and the surface cracked, and underneath it was the woman watching her son wave at aeroplanes on a June afternoon, who cried when the crowd was louder than she had expected. That was who was there. The Scobie source said cold. One anonymous source in one pro-Sussex book. Cold if she doesn't like someone. 11 words. That is the entire primary source for the characterization that became the title of this account, and the question that the preceding 9 parts have been assembling the evidence to answer. So here is the honest answer. She is not cold. But the honest answer is not simply that she is warm either, because the warm is the word of the Tom Quinn staff accounts, and the extraordinary privilege, and the totally fondly, and those words are the words of the people who have understood what they can say and what they cannot. The warm is real, but the warm is also the selected version of what is real. The honest answer is more specific than cold, and more complicated than warm. Start with what the evidence actually shows. The staff who worked most closely with her, not the anonymous sources, not the pro-Sussex commentators, not the unflattering nicknames, described her consistently as warm, calm, kind. Tom Quinn spoke to hundreds of current and former palace staff and found no one with anything negative to say about the Duchess of Cambridge. Not one account. Across the 13 years of the operation, the people who were inside the daily reality of the household produced the warm, and the calm, and the kind, and the extraordinary privilege, and the totally fondly. Natasha Archer worked alongside her for 15 years. 15 years of the daily proximity, the outfit choices, the tours, the engagements, the 3 births, the cancer. 15 years. The word she used was privilege, not duty, not service, privilege. The distinction between privilege and duty is the distinction between the person who wants to be there and the person who is required to be there. Archer used privilege. That is the word of the person who wanted to be there. Now put that next to the Scobie source. The Scobie source is anonymous. The book it appears in is explicitly organized around the Sussex position, the position that the royal family had treated Harry and Meghan badly, that Kate had not been the supportive sister-in-law the public believed her to be, that the warmth of the curated public persona was concealing a less flattering private reality. The cold if she doesn't like someone appears in that context. It serves that argument. That does not make it false, but it requires to be read in the context it appears in, rather than as the standalone verified fact about Kate Middleton's character that the coverage has been treating it as. What is the most honest reading of cold if she doesn't like someone? It is probably accurate in a narrow and specific sense. Not the cold of the person who has no warmth. The evidence for that reading does not exist in the available record. The cold of the person who does not extend the warmth to everyone. The cold of the selective, the person who has been managing the available warmth as the tool of the managed public presence, and who, in the private setting, does not deploy the tool universally. This is not a damning character assessment. This is the description of most people who operate at the level of the public role that Kate operates at. The person who is warm to everyone regardless of context and history and personal feeling is not the emotionally sophisticated person. The person who is warm when the warmth is genuine and not warm when the warmth is not genuine is the emotionally honest person. Cold if she doesn't like someone is, in its honest reading, the description of the person who does not perform warmth she does not feel. The irony is that this is almost exactly the opposite of cold. The cold person performs the warmth they do not feel. The not cold person withholds it when they do not feel it. Now look at the Tatler. The exhausted and trapped and furious about the workload. These are the words of a person under significant pressure. Not the cold person. The cold person does not get exhausted and trapped and furious. The cold person does not feel the workload as a burden, because the cold person does not feel the workload as anything. The exhausted is the word of the person who is doing the thing and finding it hard. The trapped is the word of the person who feels the weight of the obligation they have taken on. The furious is the word of the person who has a strong enough interior response to the available situation to produce fury. Cold people do not get furious, they get distant. The Tatler sources were not describing a cold person. They were describing a person under enormous pressure who was not always managing that pressure in the private setting with the same composure she deployed in the public setting, which is the description of a human being rather than the description of a cold person. Now look at the cancer, the bench at Windsor on the 22nd of March 2024, the shirt and the jeans, and the direct address, and the huge shock, and the pauses. The specific quality of that moment was not the quality of the cold person performing the warmth they do not feel. It was the quality of the person who had been through something enormous and who was telling the truth about it, in the specific register of the person who has decided that the truth is what the moment requires. This came as a huge shock, she said that. The cold person does not say that. The cold person does not experience the huge shock in the way that produces the saying of it. The cold person produces the composed statement. Kate produced the pause. The pause is the evidence. Then look at the trooping the colour, the crowd in the mall cheering louder than she had expected, and the quiet crying, and William reaching for her hand. That moment was not the product of the cold person receiving the warmth of others. It was the product of the person who had been through the surgery, and the diagnosis, and the chemotherapy, and who was standing in the June sunshine, and who was genuinely, involuntarily moved by the crowd's response in the way that the person with a genuine interior is moved by things. Cold people are not involuntarily moved, they are voluntarily composed. Kate was involuntarily moved. So why does the cold characterization exist at all? It exists because the 13 years of the managed surface produce something that looks like cold from the outside. The curated warmth, the selecting of which version of the authentic self is available at the managed occasion, produces an experience for the people who encounter the boundary of the selection that feels like the cold. The person who is warm at the managed occasion and who does not extend the warmth to the unmanaged context produces, for the person on the other side of that boundary, the specific experience of the cold. This is different from the cold, but from the outside it feels the same. The cold of the person who has no warmth and the managed warmth of the person who has decided not to extend it here are indistinguishable from the position of the person who is not receiving it. The SCOBY source was not receiving it. The SCOBY source experienced the boundary of the selected warmth as the cold. The cold, if she doesn't like someone, is the accurate description of the experience of the person on the wrong side of the selection. It is not the accurate description of Kate Middleton's character. The character is what the 15 years of Natasha Archer and the 5 years of Rebecca Deacon and the bench in the shirt and jeans and the quiet crying at trooping the colour and the Louis waving at the red arrows together produce as the character. The character is the person who was bullied at Downe House and did not break, who absorbed the doors to manual without flinching, who waited for 10 years through the Waity Katie and the Too Common without performing the waiting, who managed the Rose Hanbury coverage in the public setting while living whatever she was living in the private one, who sat on a bench in a shirt and jeans and said, "This came as a huge shock," who cried on a balcony in June when the crowd was louder than she expected. That person is not cold, that person is formed. The formation is the Downe House survival and the Marlborough recovery and the 10 years of the careful and the not performing and the meeting of William Circle's snobbery with the never rising to it. The formation produced the managed surface. The managed surface looks like cold from the outside when you are on the wrong side of it. From the inside, from where Natasha Archer was for 15 years, from where Rebecca Deacon was for 5, it looks like something else entirely. It looks like the person who learned at 12 years old that the social world's verdict on her was not necessarily the accurate verdict. Who built the managing as the response? Who brought the managing to the largest available occasion, the palace, the heir, the future queen, and who ran it for 13 years without a visible crack? The cancer was the crack, not because the cancer broke her, she is evidently not broken, but because the cancer arrived in the specific sequence that collapsed the distance between the curated surface and the actual person, and the crowd in the mall and the centre court at Wimbledon looked at the actual person and cheered. They were not cheering the cold person. They were cheering the person who had been there all along, behind the managed surface, who had been through the enormous thing, and who was standing in the sunshine, watching her son wave at aeroplanes. Cold is not the right word. The right word is controlled. And controlled, unlike cold, has a formation behind it, a reason, a history. Downe House, Marlborough, 10 years of the doors to manual, the palace saying too common, the 10 years of the Waity Katie. Controlled is not empty. Controlled is full of everything the formation put there, and everything the 13 years on top of it put there, and the bench in the shirt and the jeans, and the enormous thing, and the quiet crying, and Louis waving at the red arrows. That is not the cold. That is the person. Natasha Archer left in July 2025. The timing matters. Not because there is a sinister reading of the timing, there is not, but because the timing places the departure in the specific context that the departure requires to be understood in. Kate had announced remission from cancer in January 2025. She was rebuilding her public role after the surgery, and the diagnosis, and the chemotherapy, and the trooping the colour, and the Wimbledon, and the phased return to duties that the recovery had required. She was finding, in her own words, her new normal. And in July 2025, the person who had been there for all of it left. 15 years. Natasha Archer had been at Kensington Palace since 2010, the year of the engagement, the year before the wedding, the year before everything that followed. She had been there before the public persona was fully built, had been part of the building of it, had been the person who sourced the dresses and managed the diary and flew to Bhutan and walked the 5-hour hike and arrived at the Lindo wing with the outfit and the baby seat before George was born and stayed through Charlotte and Louis and the international tours and the Caribbean criticism and the Meghan years and the cancer. 15 years of all of it. The palace operation gave her the Royal Victorian Order in 2019. William placed the medal himself at an investiture at Buckingham Palace. The medal is the specific honour the sovereign gives for personal service to the royal family, not the public service honour, the personal one. The medal placed by William personally was the specific gesture of the household that values the person in the way that the household values the people it values most. In 2022, she was promoted to Senior Private Executive Assistant. Sources described the promotion as a reward for her loyalty. One source said the appointment meant we could expect to see Natasha by Kate's side for years to come. The medal, the promotion, the years to come. All of it was the signal of the long-term relationship, the signal of the person who is in this for the duration, rather than the person who is passing through. She left 18 months after the promotion. The official reason was the private consultancy. She had built a website. She had set up an Instagram. She had described herself as a creative consultant, offering a highly personalized service for individuals leading really complex lives. The highly personalized service for individuals leading really complex lives is the description of the work she had been doing for the individual leading the most publicly complex life in Britain for the past 15 years. She was taking that skill and offering it to different individuals. This is not suspicious. People leave jobs. Senior people leave good jobs to start their own businesses. The building of a consultancy from the specific expertise developed over 15 years in the most scrutinized household in Britain is a rational professional decision. There is no available evidence of a falling out. The Wales household statement was warm. Her own interview was warm. The extraordinary privilege, the incredible friendships, the totally fondly. But the timing is still the timing. She left in the specific month that Kate was describing her new normal and finding the pace that the recovery required and rebuilding the public role that the cancer had interrupted. She left at the moment when the rebuilding was the specific activity, when the person who had managed the diary and the outfits and the logistics of the public role for 15 years was most precisely the person whose departure would be felt. There is a particular quality to the departure of the person who has been with you for 15 years at the moment you are rebuilding. Not betrayal. Nothing in the available record suggests betrayal, but loss. The loss of the person who has been present for everything and who leaves at the moment when the everything is being reconstructed. Kate had lost people before. Rebecca Deacon after 5 years. Catherine Quinn after 2. Unusual, the Daily Mail had called it. Sophie Agnew made redundant on her return from honeymoon. Hannah Cockburn-Logie, after 2.5 years, personal reasons. Alison Caulfield, who never started. Each departure had been managed in the available warm statement. Each had been absorbed. Each had produced the silence that the palace operation produces in the people who leave it. But Natasha Archer was different from the others, in the specific sense that 15 years of the daily proximity is different from 5 years, or 2.5 years, or 2 years. 15 years is the relationship in which the boundaries between the professional and the personal have been tested by the duration. 15 years of the outfit choices, and the diary management, and the Bhutan hike, and the Lindo wing, and the cancer, is the relationship that the professional designation of personal assistant does not fully contain. She said so herself. In the Telegraph interview, she described her role as not a traditional stylist. She said there are a lot of other things that came with my role. She said she looked at everything, even admin support. She said she was looking at everything because I feel like it's a unique talent that I can bring to specific people. And she said she just loved supporting people. There are so many levels of support. Yes, admin, but also just being there sometimes. Being that calmness to someone. Being that calmness to someone. This is the sentence that the Telegraph interview produced that is worth the most attention. Not the extraordinary privilege. Not the totally fondly. Those are the expected sentences. The sentences of the person who has worked for the royal family and who understands what can be said in a public interview about working for the royal family. The extraordinary privilege and the totally fondly are the form. Being that calmness to someone is the content. The calmness. The person who for 15 years had been the calmness to the someone. The someone who had been through the 10 years of the waiting and the Waity Katie and the too common and the palace operation and the managed warmth of the 92 engagements and the Rose Hanbury coverage and the cancer surgery and the cancer diagnosis and the chemotherapy and the balcony and the bench in the shirt and the jeans. The calmness had been there for all of it, and in July 2025, the calmness left. She also said that she often gets referred to as a stylist, and it's quite frustrating. The quite frustrating is the word that contains, in its specific 2-word form, the 15 years of being the calmness to someone being reduced, in the available public account, to the person who picked the clothes. The quite frustrating is what the 15 years of the everything looks like when the everything gets described as the wardrobe function. It is possible to hear, in the quite frustrating, the sound of a person who had been considerably more than a stylist for 15 years and who is mildly annoyed that the considerably more has not been recognized in the form the recognition would take if the considerably more were available to be described. But the considerably more is not available to be described. The considerably more is the 15 years of the private service to the private household whose privacy is exactly what the private service protects. The quite frustrating is all that is available. She also, and this detail appeared in the coverage without much examination, unfollowed Meghan Markle on Instagram when she made her profile public after leaving Kensington Palace. She had been following Meghan. She unfollowed her after leaving. She had also been following people in Meghan's inner circle. She unfollowed them too. This is a small thing. Social media follows and unfollows are not the evidence of the complex institutional allegiances. People clean up their follows when they change jobs. But the specific act of the person who had been the calmness to Kate for 15 years, making her Instagram public, and then unfollowing Meghan and Meghan's associates, is the act that the coverage noted without knowing quite what to do with. It is probably nothing more than the professional tidying of the person who is moving from one household to a new business venture and who is organizing her public-facing social media presence in the form that the new business venture requires, rather than the form that the previous institutional role required. It is also the action of a person who had spent 15 years in the specific household that the Sussex departure had reorganized, and who is now leaving that household, and who is making the social media decisions that a person in that specific position makes when they are leaving. The decisions are hers. The reading of them is the reader's. What is established is the 15 years and the medal, and the promotion, and the years to come, and the July 2025 departure, and the extraordinary privilege, and the totally fondly, and the quite frustrating, and the being that calmness to someone, and the new consultancy, and the website, and the creative consultant, and the Instagram. And what is also established is the specific timing, the leaving in the month of Kate's rebuilding, in the year of Kate's new normal, in the specific period when the person who had been the calmness to someone for 15 years was the person whose continued presence would have been the continued calmness during the specific activity of the rebuilding. She left. Kate is rebuilding without her. The palace issued the warm statement. Natasha gave the Telegraph interview. She said extraordinary privilege and totally fondly. She said being that calmness to someone. She said quite frustrating. And then the silence that the palace produces in the people who leave it closed around the 15 years, and the medal, and the Bhutan hike, and the Lindo wing, and the cancer. The silence is the same silence that has closed around Rebecca Deacon's 5 years, and Catherine Quinn's 2 unusual years, and Sophie Agnew's 7 years, made redundant on her honeymoon return, and Hannah Cockburn-Logie's 2.5 years of personal reasons, and Alison Caulfield who never started. The same silence, each time, the extraordinary privilege, and the totally fondly, and the quite frustrating, and then the silence. Kate is rebuilding. The calmness has gone. The new normal is the new normal without the person who had been the calmness for 15 years. That is the honest picture of July 2025. Jason Knauf arrived at Kensington Palace in 2015 with no background in royal communications. He had worked at the Royal Bank of Scotland. He was 32 years old. He was American, from Texas, specifically, which made him an unusual appointment in the world of the British royal household, whose communications roles had traditionally gone to the former diplomat, or the former civil servant, or the person whose formation was the formation of the British establishment, rather than the formation of the American banking sector. The appointment raised eyebrows in the Royal Press Corps. The Royal Press Corps had its own established relationships with the palace communications operation, the relationships of the journalists who cover the institution, and the communications professionals whose function is to manage what the institution makes available to the journalists who cover it. The established relationships were the relationships of the people who understood each other's positions and who managed the available access in the form that the mutual understanding produced. Knauf did not come from those relationships. He came from outside them. And the person who comes from outside the established relationships of the Royal Press Corps is the person who can do something that the person inside those relationships cannot. They can look at the operation without the assumptions that the established relationships produce and redesign it around the tools that the assumptions have been preventing from being used. He looked at the tools. The tools he saw were the tools of the mid-2010s digital landscape, the social media era that the Royal Communications operation had not yet fully entered, in the specific form that the social media era required. The palace had a Twitter account. It did not yet have an Instagram. It was producing its content in the forms that the pre-digital era had built: the press release, the photograph call, the briefing for the royal correspondence. The forms were the forms of an operation that had been built for the newspaper and the television broadcast, rather than the direct digital communication of the platform era. Knauf built the Instagram, not just the account, the strategy behind it, the specific logic of the direct communication to the audience in the form that bypassed the newspaper and the television broadcast and placed the content directly in front of the people who were going to consume it. The Kensington Palace Instagram launched in 2015. Within months it had millions of followers. The content it produced, the approved photographs, the personal messages, the behind-the-scenes glimpses of the royal couple's charitable work, was reaching an audience at a scale and with a directness that the press release and the photograph call had never achieved. This was the machine's core innovation. Not the warmth. The warmth had always been there in the person. The innovation was the delivery system, the direct line from Kensington Palace to the phone in the hand of the person who was interested in the Princess of Wales's charitable work, and who had, until 2015, required the newspaper to tell them about it. Knauf cut out the newspaper. He put the content directly in the hand, The content that went directly into the hand was the content he controlled, the approved photograph, the managed caption, the specific personal detail that made the content feel personal without being personal in the sense of the uncontrolled personal. The children baking at Christmas, the tennis enthusiasm, the behind-the-scenes glimpse of the charity visit, all of it selected, approved, timed, and delivered through the platform that reached the audience directly. He also built the Royal Foundation into a serious operation. The Royal Foundation of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, later the Prince and Princess of Wales, was the charitable organisation through which the couple's public work was organised and communicated. Under Knauf, who became its chief executive in 2019, it ran substantive programs. Heads Together, the mental health campaign that brought together 8 charities and that Kate became the public face of, was the Royal Foundation's most significant output. The early years' work that Kate made the central focus of her public role from 2020 onward was run through the Foundation's research and communications apparatus. The Foundation gave the public work a structure that the public work had not previously had. Not just the charity appearances and the managed occasions, the specific research programs and the published reports and the academic partnerships that gave the early years' work the credibility of the substantive rather than the performative. Knauf understood that the sustained public credibility of the charitable work required the substance beneath the communication. He built the substance. He built the communication around it. He was good at his job. He was also the person who filed the bullying complaint against Meghan Markle in October 2018. The complaint, filed to the palace's human resources team, said that he was very concerned that Meghan had been able to bully 2 personal assistants out of the household in the past year. The treatment of the first assistant was described as totally unacceptable. The complaint also said that Meghan seemed intent on always having someone in her sights and was bullying a 3rd member of staff and seeking to undermine her confidence. The complaint was filed in October 2018. Knauf was at that point the communications secretary for both the Cambridge and the Sussex households. The role he had held since 2015 had expanded to cover both couples in the period before the Sussex household established its own separate communications team. He filed the complaint in October 2018 in an effort to protect the staff members he described. The complaint was not acted upon at the time. It emerged publicly in March 2021 when the Times of London published it, in the days before Harry and Meghan's Oprah interview. Buckingham Palace announced an investigation. The investigation was conducted. The findings were never published. What is relevant to the account of Kate and the Kensington Palace operation is not the specific substance of the bullying complaint. That is the Meghan story, rather than the Kate story. What is relevant is what the complaint establishes about Knauf's position inside the 2 households in 2018. He filed the complaint in October 2018 as the communications secretary whose function covered both households. He was describing, in that complaint, a culture in one household that he was concerned about. The concern was about the Sussex household. He continued working for the Wales household. He became chief executive of the Royal Foundation in 2019. He received, in the public statements about his work, consistent praise from William and Kate. He left in December 2021. The Wales household announced his departure, with the specific warmth of the departure that the palace produces for the person it values. Jason has been an integral part of our team since 2015, the statement said. We are immensely grateful for his hard work and commitment. 6 years. He left in December 2021. He has not spoken publicly about his 6 years at Kensington Palace in any substantive form. Not the book, not the interview. He gave one appearance on 60 Minutes Australia, in which he described William and Kate as not interested in fame and celebrity at all, not really interested at all, and said that what you see is what you really get behind the scenes as well. What you see is what you really get behind the scenes as well. This is the Knauf assessment of the people he worked with for 6 years. It is the warmest possible assessment, the assessment that the curated public persona is not the curated public persona, but the authentic person, that the warmth of the managed occasions is the warmth of the actual person rather than the warmth of the managed occasion. He built the operation that produced the curated public persona. He is saying the curated public persona is real. These two things are not contradictory. The person who builds the delivery system for the authentic content is telling you the content is authentic. The delivery system does not manufacture the content, it delivers it. What Knauf built was the delivery system. The content was Kate. His departure in December 2021 was the departure of the person who had built the delivery system and who was now leaving the delivery system running without the person who built it. The delivery system continued. The Royal Foundation continued. The Instagram continued. The approved photographs and the managed occasions and the direct communication to the audience in the hand continued. But the person who had understood the 2024 information environment was gone. Knauf had left 3 years before the January 2024 hospital admission and the 8 weeks and the Mother's Day photograph. The person who had built the direct communication strategy, who had understood that the audience in the hand was the audience to be spoken to directly, was not in the building when the decision was made to release the Mother's Day photograph rather than the direct personal communication. This is not the argument that Knauf would have prevented the photograph. Nobody knows what Knauf would have done, but the photograph decision was the decision of an operation that had been built around the direct personal communication and that reached, in the crisis of the 8 weeks, for the indirect, the photograph issued through the wire services rather than the direct address to the audience, and produced the outcome that the indirect produced. The March 22nd video was the direct address. The March 22nd video was the decision that Knauf's framework would have recognized. The direct communication to the audience in the hand, in the specific register that the trust problem required. But it came 12 days after the photograph, and the photograph had cost the trusted source designation before the video arrived. Knauf had left in December 2021. The photograph happened in March 2024. 12 days later, Kate sat on the bench in the shirt and jeans and looked at the camera and said this came as a huge shock. The Mother's Day photograph was not the first. This detail arrived quietly, buried in the coverage of the Mother's Day story, and was absorbed into the general noise of the March 2024 crisis without receiving the specific examination it deserved. 10 days after the Mother's Day photograph was killed by the wire services, Getty Images placed an editor's note on a different photograph. A photograph that had been in circulation for nearly a year. A photograph that showed Queen Elizabeth II sitting on a sofa at Balmoral in the summer of 2022, surrounded by her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The photograph had been released in April 2023 to mark what would have been the Queen's 97th birthday. It had been taken the previous summer at Balmoral, one of the last photographs ever taken of Queen Elizabeth, who died in September 2022. The photograph showed the Queen on a patterned sofa with the children around her. It was a family photograph. It was released as the warm tribute to the grandmother and great-grandmother from the family who had lost her. Getty's editor's note said the photograph had been digitally enhanced at source. The inconsistencies that the Toronto Star outlined included a vertical line on the Queen's skirt, where the pattern did not match, 2 more vertical lines on the sofa itself, jagged edges on the left side of Prince Louis's face, and inconsistent patterns in the carpet at the right edge of the sofa. Digitally enhanced at source. The same language that the wire services had used about the Mother's Day photograph. The manipulation was not done by a third party, but by the source who supplied the image. The source was Kensington Palace. The specific significance of the second photograph is the significance of the timeline it establishes. The Mother's Day photograph was taken in early March 2024 and released on the 10th of March. The Queen's birthday photograph was taken in the summer of 2022 and released in April 2023. The gap between the two is almost exactly a year. 2 photographs, from the same source, in the space of approximately 12 months, each found to have been digitally altered before release. This is not the account that the Mother's Day photograph had been the isolated incident of the person who occasionally experiments with editing and who made a mistake in the specific crisis of the 8-week absence. The Queen's birthday photograph was not released during a crisis. It was released in April 2023, before the hospital admission, before the cancer diagnosis, before the 8 weeks of speculation. It was released in the ordinary run of the Kensington Palace content operation, as a warm tribute to the late Queen from her family, and it had been digitally altered before release. The alteration of the Queen's birthday photograph had not been discovered by the wire services in April 2023, because the wire services had not been examining the image with the specific scrutiny that the March 2024 context brought to the Mother's Day photograph. The Mother's Day photograph had been examined with the specific scrutiny of the people whose attention had been focused on every piece of content from Kensington Palace by the 8 weeks of the absence, and the speculation and the growing public concern. The scrutiny had caught the manipulation. The Queen's birthday photograph had been released in the ordinary content cycle. It had not been examined with the same scrutiny. The manipulation had not been caught at the time of release. It was caught in March 2024 because the March 2024 context directed the available scrutiny backward through the recent Kensington Palace archive, as well as forward to the current content. Getty found it, Getty noted it, and the editor's note, digitally enhanced at source, was placed on the photograph that had been in circulation for nearly a year. What the two photographs together establish is the possibility that the digital alteration of photographs before release had been the practice rather than the exception. Not the certain knowledge. The certain knowledge requires the evidence of a pattern, and two photographs is a pattern's beginning rather than a pattern's full documentation. But the possibility. The possibility is what AFP's global news director Phil Chetwynd was describing when he said that Kensington Palace was no longer a trusted source and that AFP would be more closely evaluating future photographs from the palace. The more closely evaluating was not simply the response to the Mother's Day photograph. It was the response to the discovery that the Mother's Day photograph was not necessarily an isolated incident, that the practice of releasing digitally altered photographs without disclosure had potentially been operating across the content archive before the specific scrutiny of March 2024 directed attention at it. The trusted source designation is the designation that the wire services extend to the organizations whose content they distribute without the individual examination of each piece. The trusted source is trusted because the trust has been established over time, because the previous content has been reliable, and the source has been the source whose reliability the history of the relationship has built as the available foundation for the trust. Kensington Palace had been a trusted source for 13 years. The 13 years of the reliable content had built the trusted source designation in the specific form that the 13 years of the reliable content builds it, through the accumulation of the trust that the reliable content produces when the reliable content is reliable, and the wire services distribute it on the basis of that reliability. The Mother's Day photograph broke the trusted source designation. The Queen's birthday photograph, found 10 days later, established that the broken trusted source designation was the designation that the accumulation of the 13 years had been building on a foundation that included at least 2 instances of the digitally altered photograph released without disclosure. The specific nature of the alterations in both photographs is worth noting. The Mother's Day photograph showed inconsistencies in Princess Charlotte's left hand. The hand appeared to have been moved or adjusted in the editing, producing the misalignment that the AP's photo standards identified as the manipulation that did not meet those standards. Charlotte's sleeve was also affected. Prince Louis's shoulder showed an inconsistent pattern. Kate's jacket zipper was misaligned. The Queen's birthday photograph showed the vertical line inconsistencies in the Queen's skirt pattern, the lines in the sofa fabric, the jagged edge near Louis's face, the carpet pattern inconsistency. Both photographs showed the specific type of alteration that the composite editing produces, the moving of elements within the frame, the adjusting of positions or alignments, the specific digital manipulation that changes the arrangement of the photograph's content from the arrangement that the camera captured to the arrangement that the person doing the editing prefers. This is not the retouching. The retouching is the adjustment of the photograph's surface qualities, the smoothing of the skin, the brightening of the light, the adjustment of the color balance. The retouching is the standard practice of the professional photography industry and is not the practice that the wire services standards address in the same way. The retouching is the enhancement of the existing image without changing the content. The alterations in both photographs were the content alterations, the changes to the positioning and the alignment of the elements within the frame, rather than the surface qualities of those elements. Content alteration is the category that the wire service's editorial standards address directly, because the content alteration changes what the photograph shows rather than how it shows it. The trusted source designation requires that the content of the supplied photograph is the content that the camera captured. The content of the Mother's Day photograph was not entirely the content that the camera captured. The content of the Queen's birthday photograph was not entirely the content that the camera captured. Both had been issued as the photographs of the moments they showed. Kate apologized for the Mother's Day photograph. She described herself as an amateur photographer who occasionally experiments with editing. The apology was the personal apology in the first person, the C at the end of the Instagram post. The Queen's birthday photograph received no specific apology. The Getty editor's note was placed on it. The palace did not comment. The not commenting on the Queen's birthday photograph is the not commenting of the palace that has been asked to comment on the second instance of the digitally altered photograph, and that has decided the not commenting is the available response. The available response was the not commenting. The not commenting was the palace's management of the second instance in the form that the not commenting manages the things that the not commenting manages. The editorial note on the Queen's birthday photograph remains on the image. The image is still in the Getty archive, with the editor's note attached. Digitally enhanced at source. The note does not say who did the enhancing. The note does not say when the enhancing was done. The note says, digitally enhanced at source, meaning that the enhancement was done before the image reached Getty, at the source, which was Kensington Palace. The source that AFP's global news director called no longer a trusted source. The 13 years of the content operation had produced the trusted source designation. The trusted source designation had been the foundation of the operation's ability to distribute its content through the wire services to the outlets that the wire services supplied. The Mother's Day photograph and the Queen's birthday photograph together produced the withdrawal of that designation. Two photographs, 12 months apart, the same source, the same category of alteration, one crisis, one ordinary content release, both found. The withdrawal of the trusted source designation is the most significant professional consequence of the March 2024 events for the Kensington Palace operation. Not the speculation about Kate's health, that was resolved by the cancer announcement. Not the conspiracy theories, those faded as the cancer announcement provided the explanation the absence had required. The withdrawal of the trusted source designation is the professional consequence that does not fade with the explanation. AFP was more closely evaluating future photographs. The standard of scrutiny applied to Kensington Palace content had been permanently raised by the two photographs and the trusted source's withdrawal. Every future photograph from the palace would be examined with the scrutiny that photographs from trusted sources are not normally examined with. The operation that Knauf had built over 6 years, the direct communication to the audience, the curated content, the approved photographs, was now operating under the raised scrutiny of the not trusted source rather than the lower scrutiny of the trusted one. The photographs had cost more than the trusted source designation. They had cost the specific operational condition, the distribution of the palace's content on the basis of the trust that the 13 years had built, that had been the foundation of the operation's reach. The operation continues, the content continues, Kate continues, but the scrutiny is different now. The photographs changed the scrutiny permanently. Two photographs, both from the same source, both found in the same 10-day window in March 2024. The first was the one everyone remembers. The second was the one that established it was not the first time. In September 2023, party pieces went into administration. The company that Carol Middleton had started from the kitchen table of the family home in Bradfield Southend in 1987, the mail-order party supplies business that had grown from a kitchen table operation into a £30 million enterprise, and that had funded the Marlborough College fees and the St Andrews education and the gap year in Florence, and the specific social trajectory that had produced the person who met William at the university and who became the Princess of Wales, went into administration in September 2023. Receivers were called in. The company's assets were assessed. The business that had been running for 36 years was wound down. The kitchen table enterprise that Carol had built while her daughter was learning to manage the social world of Downe House was gone. The timing. September 2023 was 4 months before the January 2024 hospital admission. 5 months before the cancer diagnosis. The business that had made the Middletons the people who could get Kate to the palace collapsed in the specific year that Kate's cancer was developing, in the specific form that it was developing in. The form that would produce the surgery in January and the diagnosis in March and the chemotherapy beginning in late February. The two events, the party pieces administration and the cancer diagnosis, are not connected medically. The stress of the business's collapse did not cause the cancer. The cancer is not the consequence of the administration. These are separate events that happened in the same period of the same family's life, but they happened to the same family. And the family is the Middletons, the specific formation that produced the person who became the Princess of Wales. Party Pieces had been more than a business. It had been the specific mechanism through which the Middleton formation had been funded and organized. The school fees required money. Marlborough College costs money. St Andrews costs money. The Florence Gap Year costs money. The specific social trajectory that produces the person who can navigate the aristocratic social world of St Andrews and meet the future king and manage the 10 years of the Waity Katie without breaking costs money, in the specific form of the school fees and the university fees and the gap year and the clothes and the social occasions that the trajectory requires. The money came from Party Pieces, not from old money, from the mail-order party supplies business that Carol had started at the kitchen table while Michael was working at British Airways. New money. Very specifically new money. The money made from selling party bags and balloons and themed tableware to British parents who wanted to give their children the birthday parties that the available budget permitted, when the available budget was the budget of the British middle-class family of the late 1980s and 1990s. The British press had been contemptuous of this. The Middletons' commercial success had been the specific target of the snobbery that the British class system deploys against the people who have made money rather than inherited it. Doors to manual. Kate middle class. Trade. The trade jibe was the jibe of the British upper class toward the people whose money came from selling things rather than from owning things, from the commerce of the shop rather than the inheritance of the estate. Party Pieces sold things. It sold them very successfully for 36 years. The selling funded everything, and then it stopped. The specific reasons for the administration were the reasons that small and medium-sized businesses go into administration in the post-pandemic British economy of 2023. The supply chain disruptions and the energy costs and the changed consumer behaviors of the period following the pandemic and the specific competitive pressures of the online retail environment in which the small specialist retailer is competing against the logistics operations of the global platform companies, whose scale produces the price points that the small specialist retailer cannot match. Party Pieces was a small specialist retailer. It had been successful in the pre-internet era of the mail-order catalog. The internet had changed the party supplies market in the specific way that the internet changes the markets it enters. By making the comparison between the available options instantaneous and by reducing the friction between the consumer's decision and the purchase that the reduction of friction produces, when the reduction of friction is the reduction that the platform company's logistics operation achieves. The party supplies market in 2023 was not the party supplies market of 1987. The company that Carol had built for the 1987 market had been adapting across the 36 years. But adaptation has limits. The administration was the limit. The Middleton family had known the business was in difficulty before September 2023. The accounts filed at Companies House in the years before the administration showed the declining revenues and the increasing pressures that the administration ultimately formalized as the available outcome, when the available outcome was the administration. The family had been managing the business's difficulties in the specific way that families who have built a business manage the business's difficulties, with the hope that the difficulties are temporary and the adjustments that the temporary difficulties require, rather than the recognition that the difficulties are the permanent condition that the administration formalizes. The recognition came in September 2023. The receivers came in September 2023. The 36 years ended in September 2023. Michael and Carol Middleton's personal financial position following the administration is not publicly known in the specific form that would allow the precise assessment of the impact. Party Pieces was a private limited company. The personal finances of the company's directors are separate from the company's finances in the legal structure of the private limited company. The administration of the company does not automatically produce the personal financial devastation of the directors in the specific form that the company's administration takes, but the income stream ends. The business that had been generating the income that funded the trajectory ends. And the family that had been the specific formation that Party Pieces funded, the family of the Princess of Wales, absorbed the ending in the specific period that the family was also absorbing the cancer diagnosis and the chemotherapy and the return to public duties. Kate did not speak publicly about the Party Pieces administration. The palace did not comment. The Middleton family did not issue statements. The administration was covered in the business press and in the royal coverage as the specific event it was, the collapse of the family business that had produced the specific trajectory, and was managed in the available silence of the family that manages the available things in the available silence. The silence was the same silence that the palace produces in the people who leave it. The Middleton family silence is a different silence, the silence of the private family managing the private event, rather than the silence of the palace managing the departures. But the form of the silence is the same form, the not commenting, the not issuing of statements, the management of the private event in the private form of the event that requires the private management. What the Party Pieces administration means for the account of Kate Middleton and who she is the meaning that the honest examination of the formation requires, rather than the meaning that the sympathetic reading of the administration or the dismissive reading of the administration produce. The sympathetic reading is the reading of the person whose family business has collapsed and who deserves the specific sympathy of the person whose family business has collapsed. The dismissive reading is the reading of the person whose new money formation has been confirmed in its new money character by the collapse of the new money business. The honest reading is more specific than either. Party Pieces was the mechanism. The mechanism funded the formation. The formation produced the person. The person became the Princess of Wales. The Princess of Wales became the future queen. The future queen is what the mechanism's 36 years of the kitchen table operation and the catalogue and the online shop and the balloon orders and the party bag sales produced as the available output of the 36 years. The mechanism is gone. The output is still there. The output is on the balcony at Trooping the Colour, watching Louis wave at aeroplanes. The output is in the white Catherine Walker dress, receiving the standing ovation at Wimbledon. The output is in remission from cancer in 2025 and rebuilding the public role without Natasha Archer and finding the new normal that the recovery requires. The mechanism that produced the output collapsed 4 months before the surgery and 5 months before the diagnosis. Carol Middleton started Party Pieces in 1987 when Kate was 5 years old. She ran it for 36 years. In the year that her daughter was diagnosed with cancer and was managing the cancer and the chemotherapy and the 8 weeks and the photograph and the bench in the shirt and the jeans, the business that had made all of it possible went into administration. This is the honest picture of the Middleton Formation's foundation in 2023. The kitchen table enterprise that had funded the trajectory, the mail-order catalogue that had paid for Marlborough, the balloon orders that had paid for St. Andrews, the party bag sales that had paid for the Florence gap year, the £30 million valuation that had made the Middletons the people who could fund the trajectory to the palace, all of it, gone in September 2023, 4 months before the surgery, 5 months before the diagnosis, in the same year as both. The formation that Party Pieces built is permanent. The Downe House survival and the Marlborough recovery, and the 10 years of the Waity Katie and the palace saying too common, and the managed warmth, and the curated public persona, and the 13 years of the operation, and the bench in the shirt and the jeans, those are permanent. The mechanism that funded the formation is gone. The formation remains, the person it produced remains, the business is in administration, the Princess of Wales is in remission. One of those sentences describes an ending, the other describes a continuation. Here is what is true about Kate Middleton in 2026. She is 44 years old. She is in remission from cancer. She is rebuilding a public role that the surgery and the diagnosis and the chemotherapy interrupted for the better part of a year. She is doing this without Natasha Archer, who was the calmness to someone for 15 years and who left in July 2025 to build her own consultancy. She is doing this without the party pieces business that funded the formation, the kitchen table enterprise that paid for Marlborough and St Andrews and the Florence gap year and that went into administration in September 2023. She is doing this in the year that her eldest child, Prince George, turned 12, the age at which the specific weight of what he is going to be starts to become more than an abstract. She is doing all of it. That is the first true thing. The second true thing is what this account set out to examine. The cold. The anonymous source in the pro-Sussex book saying cold if she doesn't like someone. The title of this video. The question the preceding 14 parts have been assembling the evidence to answer. The evidence does not support cold. The evidence supports something more complicated and more interesting than cold. 15 years of Natasha Archer calling it an extraordinary privilege and being that calmness to someone does not describe the person who works for the cold person. 5 years of Rebecca Deacon, a chapel royal wedding, the warm statement. A crowd of 80,000 people in the mall on the 15th of June 2024, cheering louder than she had expected, and the quiet crying, and William reaching for her hand. The bench at Windsor in the shirt and the jeans saying, "This came as a huge shock. Cold people do not produce any of those things." What the evidence does support is controlled. Not controlled in the diminishing sense, not the controlled of the person who is suppressing the authentic, the controlled of the person whose formation began at Downe House when she was 13, and who learned there that the social world's verdict on her was not necessarily the accurate verdict, and who built the managing of that verdict as the organizing principle of everything that followed. The managing became the selection. The selection produced the curated warmth. The warmth that the palace operation delivered through the Instagram and the approved photographs and the managed occasions. The curated warmth was real warmth. The curation did not manufacture it. It selected and delivered it. The SCOBY source experienced the edge of the selection. The edge of the selection is where the warmth is not deployed. The edge of the selection feels like cold from the outside. That is accurate. But the feeling of cold at the edge of the selection is not the same as the person being cold. The person is warm. The selection has an edge. The edge is not cold. Jason Knauf built the delivery system for 6 years and left in December 2021, saying what you see is what you really get behind the scenes as well. The man who built the system was telling you the content inside it was real. He had spent 6 years with the content. He knew what it was. The wire services killed the Mother's Day photograph in 5 hours. AFP called Kensington Palace no longer a trusted source. Getty found a second altered photograph. The trusted source designation was lost. These are the facts of March 2024, and they are real failures, not of Kate, but of the operation around her, operating without Knauf, reaching for the photograph rather than the person during the most scrutinized period of her public life. Then they sent the person, the bench, the shirt and jeans, the huge shock, the pause, and the trust came back. Not the wire services trust, which requires the rebuilding of the operational credibility over time, but the public's, the crowd in the mall in June, Centre Court in July, the trust that the actual person builds when the actual person replaces the curated version of the person. The curated version had been very good, 13 years. The cold that the SCOBY source described, the Katie Keen that Endgame named, the exhausted and trapped that Tatler published, none of it had broken through the curated version. The wire services did. Not because they were more perceptive than the SCOBY sources, because the 5 kill notices sent in a single Sunday afternoon in March 2024 produced the specific conditions that made the only available answer the actual person, rather than the curated one. She sat on the bench. She said the words. The formation that Downe House and Marlborough, and 10 years of the Waity Katie, and the palace saying too common had built. The formation that had produced the managed surface and the curated warmth, and the never a foot wrong, and the always perfectly turned out, sat on the bench in a shirt and jeans, and said this came as a huge shock. The surface cracked. The person underneath was not cold. The person underneath was the woman who had learned at 13 that the world's assessment of her was not necessarily accurate, who had built the managing as the response, who had brought the managing to the largest available occasion and run it for 13 years, who managed the Rose Hanbury coverage in public while living whatever she was living in private, who sent the photograph and then apologized for it and then sat on the bench, who cried on the balcony when the crowd was louder than she expected, and who watched Louis wave at aeroplanes in the June sunshine. Now she is 44, in remission, rebuilding. George is 12, Charlotte is 10, Louis is 7. The kitchen table enterprise that made all of this possible is in administration. The calmness that was there for 15 years is building a consultancy. The delivery system runs on without its architect, and she keeps arriving. Not in the way that the never-a-foot-wrong Princess of Wales arrives at the managed occasion, in the coat and the heels and the pearl earrings. In the way that the person who has been through the enormous thing keeps arriving at the next thing, imperfectly, with the surface cracked, with the photograph that the wire services killed still in the record, with the trusted source designation still being rebuilt, with the new normal that the recovery requires, and the Natasha Archer, who is no longer there to be the calmness to someone. She keeps arriving. The title of this account called her cold. The staff who left Kensington did not bury every word. They buried most words, in the warm statement, and the extraordinary privilege, and the totally fondly, and the silence that the palace produces in the people who leave it. But the words they kept, the quite frustrating, the being that calmness to someone, were the words that pointed not at cold, but at something much more human than cold. The formation made her controlled. The palace operation made her curated. The cancer made her visible. And what became visible, when the curated surface cracked, was not the cold that the SCOBY source described. It was the woman on the bench in the shirt and the jeans on the sunny afternoon at Windsor, saying this came as a huge shock. That woman is not cold. That woman is 44 years old, and in remission, and rebuilding, and watching her son wave at aeroplanes in the June sunshine. That is the last word. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, please check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you will really enjoy them. And please do not forget to subscribe if you haven't already. It means more than you know. See you in the next one.